My sister said I was not classy enough to attend her wedding. My mother told me to just let her enjoy her big day. I never showed up. That evening, every news channel was replaying the moment her groom struck her in front of hundreds of guests. I quietly finished my wine. I knew exactly what had happened. My name is Madeline, and I am 33 years old. I live in a sprawling penthouse in downtown Chicago, far above the noise of the city streets. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. I sat alone in the quiet sanctuary of my living room, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of Lake Michigan. The rain beat softly against the thick glass, creating a rhythmic drumming sound that usually brought me peace. Tonight, however, the tranquility of my home stood in stark contrast to the absolute chaos unfolding on my massive television screen. I held a crystal glass of vintage Cabernet in my hand, swirling the dark red liquid slowly as I watched the local news channel. They were playing a viral video on a continuous loop, and I could not look away. The video was amateur footage, captured on a smartphone by an incredibly stunned wedding guest. The quality was slightly grainy, but the content was undeniably clear. It was my 29-year-old sister Chelsea. She was standing at the altar of one of the most historic and expensive cathedrals in the city. She wore a custom $30,000 designer gown that our parents had taken out a second mortgage to afford. The dress was an extravagant display of silk and lace, featuring a cathedral-length train that pooled around her feet like a cloud. The church itself was adorned with tens of thousands of dollars worth of white roses and orchids. It was the society wedding of the decade, the ultimate social triumph my family had been striving for my entire life. Chelsea was supposed to be marrying Preston Kensington, the handsome and usually composed heir to a massive real estate empire. The Kensington family filled the front pews, radiating old money and high-class expectations. But the clip did not begin with vows. It began in the middle of a scream. Preston Kensington stood at the altar with his tuxedo jacket hanging open and a thick stack of documents scattered around his shoes. Chelsea was directly in front of him, one hand gripping his lapel and the other clawing toward the papers. The camera shook as the guest recording tried to understand what was happening. Somewhere near the microphone, Preston's voice cut through the cathedral. "You stole from children. And you did it with him." The camera jerked toward Carter Vance, Preston's best man. Carter's face was gray. Two security guards were already moving toward him from the side aisle. Chelsea slapped Preston across the mouth so hard that his head snapped sideways. A red mark appeared immediately along his cheek. She reached for him again, screaming that the documents were fake and that someone had set her up. Preston caught her wrist, but she twisted free and struck him a second time, this time raking her nails across his face. Then came the moment every station kept replaying. Preston's open hand moved once, fast and flat, striking Chelsea across the cheek as he forced her away from him. The sound cracked through the officiant's microphone and echoed beneath the cathedral ceiling. Chelsea staggered backward, her heel caught in the long train of her gown, and she fell onto the marble steps among the papers. The recording froze there for half a second, capturing her expression of disbelief before the entire altar dissolved into movement. My mother rose from the front pew with both hands pressed to her chest. Patricia stared at the documents near Chelsea's gown, let out a broken cry and collapsed sideways. My father lunged to catch her, while the Kensington family stood in rigid silence. Guests began shouting. Phones lifted into the air. Security rushed toward Chelsea and Carter as the live stream cut in and out beneath the weight of thousands of viewers. The station replayed only fragments because the original feed had become chaotic. No one watching from home yet knew what was printed on the pages, why Carter was being restrained, or why federal vehicles were already appearing outside the reception venue. I knew. Every page had come from my investigation. I sat in my luxurious penthouse, miles away from the screaming and the tears. I did not gasp when the groom struck my sister. I did not feel a single ounce of sympathy for my mother as she collapsed into the aisle. I simply brought the crystal glass to my lips and took another, long, deliberate sip of my wine. The taste was rich and complex, but nothing compared to the sweet taste of absolute vindication. I watched the papers scattering across the television screen, knowing exactly what was printed on every single page. I knew the contents of those documents because I was the one who had compiled them. I was the one who had verified the offshore bank transfers. I was the one who had traced the hidden internet protocol logs. I was the one who had uncovered the explicit text messages and the undeniable proof of a monumental betrayal. I was the architect of the devastating dossier that was currently destroying my sister's perfectly manufactured life. The news broadcast cut away from the viral video and returned to the studio. A seasoned news anchor appeared on the screen, looking genuinely baffled by the footage he had just presented. He adjusted his tie, leaned forward, and looked directly into the camera. He asked the question that was currently trending across every social media platform in the country. Who leaked the devastating dossier that ruined the society wedding of the decade? The anchor speculated about rival real estate firms, scorned ex-lovers, and corporate espionage. He listed every possible theory, wondering aloud who possessed the skills and the motive to pull off such a precise and destructive public execution. I set my wine glass down on the smooth surface of my marble coffee table. A quiet smirk played on my lips as the anchor continued to list his theories. The irony of the situation was almost too perfect to believe. Just 1 week ago, my sister had banned me from that very cathedral. She had looked me in the eye and told me I was not classy enough to breathe the same air as the Kensington family. She had banished me because she believed my presence would somehow ruin her flawless high society image. She told me I was a social liability, an awkward failure who would only bring shame to the family name. For my entire life, I had swallowed their insults. I had allowed my parents and my sister to paint me as the disappointing, low-class outcast of the family. They thought I was nothing more than an insignificant computer repair girl, fixing routers for a pathetic hourly wage. They looked down on me because I chose to work hard behind a screen rather than chase after wealthy men and superficial status symbols. They had absolutely no idea who I really was. They had no idea about the massive agency I had built from the ground up, or the incredible power I held at my fingertips. I reached for the remote control and turned off the television, plunging my living room back into peaceful silence. The rain continued to tap against the glass, a soothing contrast to the storm I had unleashed upon my family. I leaned back into my plush sofa and closed my eyes, letting the memories of the past week wash over me. To understand how Chelsea ended up humiliated on national television, to understand how the golden child of the family fell so far and so fast, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to go back to the exact moment they finally pushed me too far. We have to go back to exactly 1 week ago, to a private dining room in a high-end steakhouse where my family made the biggest and most destructive mistake of their entire lives. Exactly 1 week earlier, the atmosphere inside the private dining room of the Oak Room Steakhouse was already suffocating. The heavy scent of roasted garlic, dry-aged beef, and expensive dark red wine hung thick in the air. Across from me, my 29-year-old sister, Chelsea, was happily holding court. She was glowing with the kind of smug satisfaction that only comes from knowing you are the absolute center of attention. She wore a pristine white silk dress and a diamond engagement ring so large it caught the dim lighting every time she gestured. My father Richard sat to her right, leaning in with rapt attention as she described the lavish floral arrangements for her upcoming cathedral wedding. My mother, Patricia, sat to her left, nodding enthusiastically and occasionally reaching out to pat Chelsea on the arm. I was simply the audience, a mandatory prop brought in to witness the grand spectacle of my sister joining the high society elite. The conversation had been entirely one-sided since we sat down. Chelsea did not ask how my week was going, and my parents certainly did not care to inquire about my life in Chicago. All they cared about was the Kensington family empire. Preston Kensington was not just wealthy, he was the heir to a massive fortune. A man who had been handed the keys to the kingdom the day he was born. To my parents, Chelsea was not just getting married, she was elevating our entire bloodline. My father raised his glass of scotch and offered his fourth toast of the evening. To Chelsea, he said, his voice booming with pride. "The girl who is finally putting our family name exactly where it belongs, right at the very top." I raised my water glass in a silent, mechanical response. My mother shot me a disapproving look from across the table, her eyes darting pointedly to my simple, navy blue blazer. She always had a way of making her disappointment known without saying a single word. Chelsea took a dainty sip of her sparkling water and set the crystal glass down. She folded her manicured hands on the pristine white tablecloth and fixed her gaze directly on me. The vibrant, joyful energy she had been projecting for our parents vanished in an instant, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. She reached into her designer handbag, resting on the empty chair beside her, and pulled out a sleek, rectangular envelope. It was made of thick, textured cream paper sealed with a heavy gold wax stamp bearing the Kensington family crest. I watched carefully as she pressed 2 fingers against the envelope and slowly slid it across the polished wood of the table. It came to a stop right next to my dinner plate. I looked at the envelope and then back up at my sister. I assumed it was my formal wedding invitation finally being delivered, after weeks of her claiming they were delayed in the mail. "Go ahead and open it," Chelsea said, her voice smooth and unnervingly calm. My mother leaned forward, her eyes sparkling with anticipation. I wiped my hands on my linen napkin, picked up the envelope, and broke the gold wax seal. I reached inside, expecting to pull out an ornate letterpress card detailing the time and location of the ceremony. Instead, I pulled out a single sheet of stark white printer paper. It read, "Approved conversation topics." I scanned the lines of text, feeling a cold knot form in the pit of my stomach. It was a bulleted list of rules specifically designed for me. Do not discuss your employment status. Do not mention your apartment or neighborhood. If asked about your hobbies, mention reading classical literature or attending symphony performances. Do not bring up anything related to computers or technology. Speak only when spoken to by a member of the Kensington family, and keep your answers brief. I read the list a second time, my mind struggling to process the sheer audacity of the document holding it in my hands. It was a meticulous, calculated attempt to erase my entire identity. Chelsea was inspecting her perfect manicure, pretending to be bored, but I could see the malicious delight dancing in her eyes. "What exactly is this?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. I refused to give her the satisfaction of seeing my hands shake. My mother let out an impatient huff and crossed her arms. "It is exactly what it looks like, Madeline," she said sharply. "It is a simple set of guidelines to ensure you do not embarrass your sister in front of her new family. The Kensingtons are very particular people, and we cannot have you saying the wrong thing and ruining the impression Chelsea has worked so hard to build." Chelsea finally looked up from her nails and offered a condescending smile. "Do not pretend you do not understand, Madeline," she sneered, her voice dripping with venom. "Preston's family is old money. They belong to country clubs that have waiting lists longer than your entire lifespan. We simply cannot have a computer repair girl showing up to the biggest event of the decade in off-the-rack clothes, stuttering about her boring little tech support job." She leaned across the table, her eyes locking onto mine with absolute contempt. You are just too low class for this aesthetic, Madeline. You are a complete social liability. The words hung in the air, heavy and toxic. My father nodded in agreement, taking another sip of his scotch, as if my sister had just stated an undisputed fact of the universe. For years, they had mocked my career choice, laughing at my dedication to technology while they funded Chelsea's frivolous lifestyle. They had absolutely no idea who I really was or the kind of power I wielded on a daily basis. She sat back in her plush leather chair and crossed her slender arms, looking at me with pure, unadulterated disgust. That list is just a precaution, she continued, her tone turning completely icy. Because the absolute truth is, Madeline, your invitation has been formally revoked. You are not coming to the cathedral. You are not coming to the lavish reception afterward. You simply do not fit into my new reality, and I refuse to let your awkward, depressing presence cast a dark shadow over my perfect, flawless life. You are not classy enough to be associated with the pristine Kensington name, and you never will be. I sat perfectly still, absorbing the full weight of her cruel declaration. My mother was nodding in agreement, her face devoid of any maternal warmth or sympathy. My father looked at his watch, clearly eager to move past this unpleasant business and order another round of drinks. They had sat around their pristine kitchen island and decided together that I was a stain on their perfect family portrait. I looked down at the humiliating piece of printer paper in my hand, reading the words, "Approved conversation topics, one last time." I felt a slow, deliberate shift deep inside my chest. The lifelong desire to please them completely evaporated into thin air. I folded the paper neatly in half and placed it gently next to my plate. I calmly set my heavy silver fork down on the pristine white tablecloth. I rested my hands in my lap and lifted my chin, refusing to break eye contact with my sister. The real conflict was just beginning. I let the silence stretch for a long, uncomfortable moment, allowing the weight of her cruelty to settle over the table. The ambient noise of the steakhouse, the clinking of silver against china, the low hum of wealthy patrons discussing their portfolios seemed to fade away entirely. I looked at the extravagant seafood tower melting in the center of the table and then back to my sister. "I wear off the rack clothes because I actually pay my own bills, Chelsea," I said, my voice low and steady. "I do not rely on men to fund my existence, and I certainly do not rely on Mom and Dad." I leaned forward just an inch, making sure she heard every single syllable. "Much like I wore a $10 thrift store dress to your college graduation?" I watched my mother flinch at the memory, but I refused to stop. "I bought that dress from a clearance rack that smelled faintly of mothballs and dust." I continued, keeping my gaze locked on Chelsea. "I wore it because Mom and Dad completely drained my savings account just days before the ceremony. They took every single dime I had spent 4 years earning from my after-school jobs, and they handed it directly to you. They funded your luxurious influencer trip to Dubai so you could take pictures in the desert and pretend you were already a wealthy socialite. I had to pay for my own textbooks, my own rent, and my own groceries, while you drank imported champagne on a yacht using my hard-earned money." The reaction was instantaneous and violent. My father Richard slammed his heavy fist down onto the polished mahogany table with such brute force that the entire surface shook. The expensive crystal wine glasses rattled dangerously against each other, and a few drops of dark red Cabernet spilled onto the pristine white tablecloth, blooming like fresh blood. "Do not you dare ruin your sister's mood," he bellowed, his face flushing a deep, angry shade of crimson. He pointed a thick finger directly at my face, completely ignoring the startled glances of the diners at the tables next to us. "We used that money as an investment in Chelsea's brand. It was seed money for her future, and look at her now." He gestured wildly toward Chelsea, who had managed to squeeze out a single perfect tear that rested dramatically on her powdered cheek. "She is marrying a Kensington," he declared, his voice trembling with furious pride. "She is securing the financial and social future of this entire family. She understood the assignment, Madeline. She knew exactly what it took to elevate our social standing, and she executed it flawlessly." He leaned across the table, his eyes narrowing with deep-seated disgust. "And what have you done with your life? You fix routers for minimum wage. You hide behind a computer screen all day long doing God knows what for a pathetic hourly rate. You have contributed absolutely nothing to this family's legacy. You have no ambition, no class, and no vision." I did not flinch as his words hit me. I had heard variations of this exact speech for the past decade. Before I could even formulate a response, my mother Patricia chimed in, right on cue. She reached across the table and placed her hand over Chelsea's, gently patting her knuckles in a show of maternal solidarity. "Your father is right, Madeline," she said, her tone laced with that familiar, sickeningly sweet disappointment she always reserved exclusively for me. "Chelsea has worked incredibly hard to curate this flawless life. She has spent years cultivating the right relationships and networking with the right people. This wedding is the culmination of all her efforts. It is her flawless day." My mother looked at me with cold, empty eyes. "We simply cannot risk you causing a scene or saying something inappropriate to Preston's relatives. You lack the necessary social grace, Madeline. It would be best for everyone if you just stayed home. Let your sister enjoy her big day without having to worry about what you are wearing or what embarrassing thing might slip out of your mouth. You can watch the professional video later. It is really the most supportive thing you can do for her right now." The absolute finality in her voice confirmed what I had always known deep down. I was not a member of this family. I was a dark secret they were desperately trying to sweep under the rug. I looked at the three of them sitting together in a tight, unified front. They looked so incredibly smug, so entirely certain of their innate superiority. They truly believed they had just put me in my proper place. Right at that exact moment, a waiter dressed in a crisp white shirt and a black vest approached our table. He carried a sleek black leather folder containing the bill for our extravagant dinner. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, sensing the heavy, hostile tension radiating from our table. He looked toward my father, assuming the patriarch would be settling the massive tab. Before the waiter could even extend his arm, I reached out and intercepted the leather folder. I pulled it toward me and opened it. The total was staggering, exactly $1,200 for imported steaks, vintage wine, and Chelsea's sparkling water. My father let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "Put that down, Madeline," he sneered, shaking his head in disbelief. "You could not even afford to pay the tax on a meal like this. Do not try to grandstand now to make yourself feel better. It is pathetic. Just go home and leave us in peace." I did not say a word. I calmly unclasped my simple leather purse and reached inside. I bypassed my standard debit cards and pulled out a solid black American Express Centurion card. It was heavy, made of anodized titanium, and it caught the dim light of the chandelier above us. I placed the black card squarely on top of the receipt inside the leather folder and closed it. I handed it back to the waiter without breaking eye contact with my father. "Please take care of this," I told the waiter, my voice perfectly polite and steady, "and keep the change for yourself." The waiter nodded gratefully and walked away. I slowly turned my attention back to my father. The mocking smile had completely vanished from his face. His jaw was slightly slack, and his eyes were darting toward the retreating waiter. Richard was a man who worshipped wealth. He knew exactly what a black American Express card was. He knew that you could not even apply for one. He knew that it required an exclusive invitation from the bank and millions of dollars in annual spending just to maintain. He blinked several times, his brain completely short-circuiting as it tried to reconcile the image of his low-class computer repair daughter with the ultimate symbol of limitless financial power. But how he stammered, his voice suddenly weak and unsure. "Where did you get?" I did not wait around to hear the rest of his question. I pushed my chair back and stood up. I smoothed the wrinkles out of my navy blue blazer and looked down at my family one last time. "Enjoy the wedding," I said, my voice entirely devoid of emotion. "I am sure it will be a day none of you will ever forget." I turned on my heel and walked away. I did not look back as I navigated through the crowded dining room, ignoring the stares of the other patrons who had witnessed the dramatic end to our family dinner. I stepped out of the heavy oak doors of the steakhouse and out into the crisp evening air. The city of Chicago was bustling around me, cars honking in the distance, the streetlights reflecting off the wet pavement. I took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill my lungs. The sting of their rejection was completely gone, replaced by a profound sense of purpose. I had given them one last chance to treat me with an ounce of human decency, and they had failed spectacularly. I walked briskly down the block until I reached my car. I unlocked the door and slid into the driver's seat, pulling the door shut and sealing myself inside the quiet luxury of the leather interior. As I reached to start the engine, a soft, distinct buzzing sound broke the silence. It was not my regular personal cell phone. It was the secure, heavily encrypted device I kept hidden in the center console. I opened the compartment and pulled the sleek black phone out into the dim light of the cabin. A notification glowed brightly on the locked screen. It was an encrypted text message sent through a highly secure server. I typed in my complex passcode and opened the application. The message was from one of my most prominent and demanding billionaire clients, Donovan Kensington. He was Preston's father, the patriarch of the empire my sister was so desperately trying to infiltrate. I stared at the glowing white text against the dark screen. "Has your firm finished the background sweep on my son's fiancée?" I quickly typed a brief professional response to Donovan Kensington, confirming that the final report would be delivered directly to his private server within 48 hours. I locked the screen and placed the device back into the hidden compartment. My family genuinely believed I drove a rusty, unreliable sedan to a cramped, windowless cubicle every morning. They thought I spent my days resetting passwords for frustrated office workers and crawling under desks to untangle computer cables. The truth was far more lucrative and infinitely more dangerous. I pressed the push-to-start button, and the engine of my Porsche Panamera roared to life with a deep, resonant growl. The sleek black car was a gift to myself after securing my first seven-figure corporate contract. I merged onto the damp Chicago streets, leaving the upscale steakhouse and my family's ridiculous delusions far behind me. The rain had slowed to a light drizzle, reflecting the neon city lights across the glossy hood of my car. I navigated the familiar route toward the financial district, where the true center of my world awaited. I watched the towering skyscrapers looming ahead, feeling completely in control. I did not work at a help desk. I was the founder and chief executive officer of an elite digital forensics and cybersecurity agency. I smoothly pulled into the private underground parking garage of a high-security commercial building located right in the bustling heart of the Loop. I parked in my reserved spot and walked toward the private executive elevator, taking a moment to appreciate the quiet power of the life I had built. I pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner, and the elevator doors slid open, carrying me smoothly to the top floor. The doors parted to reveal a pristine, minimalist reception area. A frosted glass wall displayed my company logo in sharp silver lettering. We did not advertise our services to the general public or maintain a social media presence. My team operated strictly in the shadows, relying exclusively on referrals from white-shoe law firms, multinational banks, and the ultra-wealthy. We specialized in the kind of problems that billionaires wanted kept completely out of the press. If a corporate executive was embezzling funds through a complex web of shell companies, we found the money. If a high society socialite was hiding offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands during a bitter divorce, we traced the digital footprints and exposed the fraud. I walked past the empty reception desk and keyed my access code into the heavy steel door that guarded the main operational floor. Despite the late hours, several of my top analysts were still at their workstations, surrounded by glowing monitors, mapping out data nodes, and tracking encrypted financial transactions. I greeted them quietly, offering a nod of approval to my lead technician before heading into my corner office. My workspace was massive, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the glittering city skyline. I dropped my keys on the polished glass desk, draped my tailored blazer over the back of my ergonomic leather chair, and quickly powered up my primary encrypted workstation to begin my review. 3 months ago, Donovan Kensington had contacted my agency, requesting a comprehensive deep dive background check on his son's sudden and overly perfect fiancée. Donovan was a man who trusted absolutely no one, especially not a younger woman who had managed to secure a proposal from his sole heir in less than a year of dating. He had spent decades building his legacy, and he refused to let an opportunist dismantle it. He sensed that Chelsea was hiding something beneath her flawless influencer persona. He recognized the calculated ambition in her eyes because it mirrored the ruthlessness he used to build his real estate empire. He wanted my firm to tear her digital life apart to find whatever skeleton she was keeping buried in her closet. He was willing to pay an exorbitant fee for total discretion and absolute certainty before he allowed his son to sign a marriage license. The Kensingtons had absolutely no idea that the ruthless corporate investigator they had hired was the biological sister of the woman they were investigating. I operated my business under a strict corporate alias, using my mother's maiden name. It provided the perfect layer of anonymity in a world that thrived on absolute secrecy and uncompromised trust. To Donovan Kensington and the rest of my elite clientele, I was Madeline Hayes. This deliberate separation of my personal and professional lives had been necessary to protect my agency from my family's constant demands for money and their toxic social climbing. I knew that if my father ever discovered my true net worth, he would demand I fund his failing business ventures. If my mother knew, she would use my status to brag to her country club friends. But keeping my identity a secret had unexpectedly placed me in the exact center of their greatest scheme. My father had just gloated at the dinner table about Chelsea securing the financial future of our family, completely oblivious to the fact that I held the power to dismantle that future with a single keystroke. I sat back in my chair and opened the secure digital dossier we had been compiling on Chelsea for the past 90 days. For the first 2 months, the investigation had yielded surprisingly little. Chelsea had spent years meticulously curating her public image to ensure she appeared perfectly acceptable to high society. Her credit score was average, her social media accounts were heavily filtered to show a life of leisure, and her banking records showed a predictable pattern of living slightly beyond her means to maintain appearances. It was a shallow, vapid existence, but it was not a criminal one. I scrolled through the initial background sweeps, feeling a familiar wave of frustration creeping into my chest. Chelsea was cunning enough to keep her overt tracks clean, and she knew how to play the part of the innocent blushing bride to perfection. But no one is completely invisible in the digital age. Every person leaves a trail, no matter how hard they try to cover their tracks. I pulled up a secondary file containing intercepted cloud backups and started running a new, complex correlation algorithm. I was looking for anomalies for tiny gaps in the timeline that might indicate a secondary hidden device or an undisclosed financial account that did not match her primary banking history. The computer hummed quietly as it processed thousands of data points, searching for a single thread that I could pull to unravel her entire facade. I stared at the progress bar as it slowly crept across the screen, wondering if my sister had truly managed to outsmart a billionaire patriarch. Just as the green bar hit 50%, the harsh, piercing buzz of my office intercom shattered the quiet concentration of the room. I blinked, pulling my eyes away from the glowing monitors, and reached over to press the flashing button on the console. It was David, my night security manager, and his voice filled the spacious office. He immediately informed me that an uninvited guest had just breached the outer lobby doors downstairs. The individual had bypassed the front desk and was now aggressively demanding to come up to my floor, refusing to listen to reason or leave the premises peacefully. He said she was screaming my corporate name and threatening to call the police if completely ignored. I pressed the intercom button. "What is the name of this guest, David?" I asked. He paused. "She says her name is Chelsea and claims to be your sister. She is making a scene down here. Should I call law enforcement?" A bitter laugh escaped my throat. Chelsea had tracked me down. I had always kept my business address vague, telling my family I worked in a generic building. She must have followed a digital breadcrumb I left behind. "Send her up, David," I instructed. "Have 2 security officers wait outside my office. I will handle this." I sprang into action. I could not let Chelsea see the sensitive financial data glowing across my monitors. I minimized the Kensington files and brought up mundane server logs. I grabbed my blazer and draped it over a chair, making myself look disorganized like a stressed mid-level employee. I walked out. Chelsea stormed onto the floor, her designer trench coat billowing behind her. She looked wildly out of place in the high-tech environment, her stilettos clicking sharply against the concrete. She paused, her eyes darting around the room, filled with advanced computer stations and analysts staring at complex code. I saw a flicker of confusion cross her face, but her arrogance quickly snuffed it out. She assumed I was just an insignificant cog in a massive corporate machine borrowing a corner of someone else's impressive headquarters. "Madeline," she barked, her voice echoing loudly across the quiet workspace. Several of my analysts looked up from their screens, annoyed by the disruption. I ushered her into a small glass-walled conference room, shutting the heavy door firmly behind us. "What on earth are you doing here, Chelsea?" I asked, crossing my arms. She completely ignored my question, dropping her expensive handbag onto the table with a heavy thud. She began pacing the room rapidly. "I need $15,000, she demanded abruptly, turning to face me. Her tone was not a request or a plea. It was an absolute, unyielding command. "I need it transferred into my checking account by tomorrow morning at the absolute latest." I stared at her, struggling to comprehend the sheer magnitude of her delusion. "You came all the way to my workplace to demand a $15,000 loan?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "What could you possibly need that kind of money for, mere days before your wedding?" Chelsea let out an exasperated sigh, throwing her hands in the air. "The floral designer completely messed up the vision," she complained. "The white orchids they sourced looked cheap and wilted. I cannot walk down the aisle surrounded by garbage, Madeline. I need to upgrade to imported peonies, and the florist is demanding payment up front. Mom and Dad are completely tapped out. They maxed out their credit cards on the reception venue. So you have to pay for it immediately." I let out a dry, humorless laugh. "I do not have to do anything, Chelsea. Even if I wanted to help you, I am not giving you a single dime for flowers. You formally revoked my invitation, remember? You told me I was too low class to attend your perfect day. Why would I fund a lavish party I am not allowed to witness?" Chelsea stopped pacing and marched right up to me, stopping inches from my face. "Because you owe me," she snarled, twisting her lips into an ugly sneer. "I am out there elevating this family's social status. I am marrying into the Kensington dynasty. I am securing elite connections that will benefit Mom and Dad for the rest of their lives. And what are you doing? You are hiding behind a keyboard in this sterile office, pretending your pathetic tech support job actually matters. I am doing the heavy lifting for our family name, while you do absolutely nothing. She was standing in the middle of a multi-million-dollar firm. She was speaking to the founder of an elite cybersecurity agency as if I were a common peasant. "Pay up, Madeline," she threatened, dropping her voice to a menacing whisper. "Or I will call Dad. Right now. I will tell him you are hoarding cash while the family sacrifices everything for this wedding. You know exactly what he will do. He will make sure you are cut out of the will. You will never see a single penny of the family money." I looked at the greedy, desperate woman standing in front of me. She was so consumed by her manufactured image that she could not see the reality around her. She was threatening to cut me out of an inheritance that was largely funded by my own secret investments in my father's failing business ventures. The grand family fortune she was so desperate to protect was practically non-existent. "I am not giving you $15,000, Chelsea," I said, my voice dropping to a calm, cold register. "I am not giving you 15 cents. Your wedding is your problem. Your aesthetic is your problem. You can walk down the aisle holding a bouquet of dead weeds for all I care. Now get out of my building before I have you physically removed." Chelsea's face turned red, her eyes widened in pure shock. I had never spoken to her with such unwavering authority before. She opened her mouth to launch into another hysterical tirade, but I simply raised my hand and snapped my fingers. The two security officers I had stationed outside immediately pushed the glass door open. They flanked Chelsea, their expressions perfectly blank. "It is time for you to leave, ma'am," the taller officer said, gesturing toward the elevator bank. Chelsea looked from the guards to me, her chest heaving with silent rage. "You are going to regret this, Madeline," she hissed, grabbing her handbag from the table. "You are dead to this family. You are nothing." She spun around and marched out, her stilettos stabbing the concrete floor. She shouted obscenities over her shoulder as the security officers calmly escorted her onto the elevator. I watched the metal doors close behind Chelsea and released a breath I had not realized I was holding. I had barely turned toward my office when Marcus, my lead technician, stepped out from behind the server partition with a silver tablet in his hand. "Boss, she connected to the guest network while she was waiting downstairs." I looked at the screen. The building's guest system had recorded Chelsea's device identifier, the time of connection, and the destinations her phone contacted during routine background synchronization. It had not exposed the contents of her messages or given us access to the files on her phone. That distinction mattered. A network log could provide a lead, but it was not permission to break into a private device. Marcus highlighted 3 destinations that did not match the ordinary social media, retail, and banking services surrounding them. One was a private domain registered through a secrecy service. Another resolved through infrastructure in the Cayman Islands. The third used a certificate name that contained a shortened version of the Kensington Family Charity Foundation's internal accounting platform. My anger disappeared beneath professional caution. "Preserve the logs exactly as they are," I told him. "No active connection, no credential testing, and no attempt to enter her device. Hash the capture, place it under legal hold, and send the summary to counsel." Marcus nodded. He understood immediately that the investigation had crossed from an ordinary background review into potential criminal conduct. Within minutes, the guest network record had been copied to an isolated evidence server. The original file was locked, time-stamped, and assigned a chain of custody number. Every person who viewed it would be recorded. I returned to my office and called Evelyn Shaw, the outside attorney who supervised the legal boundaries of our Kensington engagement. She answered on the second ring despite the late hour. I described Chelsea's visit, the network metadata, and the connection to a domain resembling the Foundation's payment system. Evelyn stopped me before I could speculate further. "Do not touch the private domain," she said. "Send me the preserved metadata and the relevant provision of Donovan's engagement letter. I will speak to Kensington Council. If the Foundation owns the systems involved, they can authorize an internal forensic audit. Anything involving Chelsea's personal accounts will require consent, a subpoena, or a warrant. That was exactly the answer I expected. It was also the answer I needed to hear. My family's cruelty did not give me the right to ignore the law, and my professional reputation had been built on evidence that could survive hostile scrutiny. The next morning, Tuesday, Donovan Kensington joined a secure call with Evelyn, two attorneys from his family office, and the Foundation's general counsel. I kept my personal relationship to Chelsea out of the discussion until the legal scope had been established. The metadata showed a potential link between her phone and the Foundation's internal payment environment. Donovan's expression hardened, but he did not order me to attack her device. Instead, he signed an expanded authorization granting my firm forensic access to every server, workstation, email account, and payment log owned by the Foundation. That authorization changed everything. By noon, my team had created verified images of the Foundation's accounting servers without altering the originals. We compared the public grant calendar against internal payment instructions and discovered a pattern hidden beneath legitimate charitable disbursements. Each time the board approved a large grant, a second payment request appeared with an almost identical description and reference number. The fraudulent request was usually entered less than 20 minutes after the legitimate one, then approved through a secondary administrative channel before the nightly reconciliation process. The transfers were not random. $50,000 at a time had been leaving the Philanthropic Reserve Fund and moving through a domestic intermediary account before disappearing offshore. The theft had continued for 6 months. More important, every false payment carried the credentials of Carter Vance. The original background material had identified Carter only as Preston's lifelong friend and best man. The Foundation records revealed the missing piece. Carter also served as deputy treasurer and director of grant operations. Donovan had appointed him 2 years earlier, at Preston's request, giving him access to vendor records and authority to release payments below a fixed threshold. Carter knew the reconciliation schedule, the internal approval limits, and the exact language used on legitimate grants. He had designed the duplicate transactions to pass unnoticed beneath routine charitable activity. Chelsea could not authorize the transfers herself, but the logs showed that her name was attached to the beneficiary company receiving the money. A corporate registration document stored in Carter's Foundation email identified a Cayman entity whose beneficial owner was listed under Chelsea's full legal name. The document had been sent from Carter's work account to an outside attorney, then carelessly archived in a folder labeled Wedding Vendors. I stared at the screen as the structure of the scheme took shape. Chelsea had supplied the destination, and Carter had supplied the access. Together, they had turned a charity into their private escape fund. We still needed independent verification. Internal records could show what the Foundation's systems had processed, but a criminal case required confirmation from the institutions that had actually moved the money. Donovan's counsel contacted the Foundation's bank, invoked the fraud provisions in its account agreement, and requested an emergency freeze on the suspicious intermediary account. The bank's investigators confirmed that the transaction identifiers in our forensic images matched transfers processed through its network. They preserved the receiving account information and notified federal authorities as required by their fraud protocols. By Tuesday evening, a financial crimes team had opened a preliminary inquiry. I did not speak to the agents as Chelsea's sister. I spoke as the chief executive of the forensic firm retained by the victim organization. Evelyn remained on every call. We provided only records obtained from Foundation-owned systems and the guest network metadata that had led us to examine them. The agents made it clear that Chelsea's personal phone cloud storage and private messages were outside our authority. They would pursue those records through lawful process. That night, my team worked in shifts. We mapped every fraudulent transfer, preserved every version of the altered grant requests, and reconstructed the approval path. The evidence showed that Carter frequently created a false payment from his office workstation, then approved it remotely minutes later using a second credential. Several approval sessions originated from hotels, where Chelsea had posted photographs during the same dates. On Wednesday morning, federal agents served preservation demands on the relevant bank and cloud providers, while prosecutors sought court orders for the private records connected to the scheme. The Foundation's general counsel also delivered Carter a formal notice requiring him to preserve all company devices. Carter replied that he was traveling and could not surrender his Foundation laptop until after the wedding. The excuse only increased suspicion. Donovan authorized us to remotely isolate that company-owned laptop from the Foundation network. We did not search it. We simply prevented new logins or deletion until law enforcement could take custody. Less than 10 minutes later, someone attempted to wipe the device through a remote management account connected to Carter's personal email. The attempt failed because the laptop had already been quarantined. The incident was recorded and immediately forwarded to the investigators. That was the moment the inquiry became urgent. By Thursday afternoon, the court-authorized returns began arriving directly to federal investigators. The bank records independently confirmed the Cayman beneficiary account, the domestic pass-through entities, and the 6-month transfer history. The registration materials named Chelsea as one beneficial owner and Carter as the authorized signatory. The cloud provider produced account records linked to the same private domain that had appeared in our guest network log. The agents invited my firm to assist with technical interpretation under a written evidence-sharing agreement. We received verified copies, not uncontrolled access to Chelsea's phone. The data had been collected under legal authority, and each file arrived with provider certifications and cryptographic signatures. Inside the return cloud records was a hidden messaging account used by Chelsea and Carter. The conversations were explicit in every sense. They discussed the duplicated charity payments, the timing of the wedding, and the amount they expected to accumulate before disappearing. Chelsea mocked Preston for trusting Carter and referred to the foundation as free money wrapped in good publicity. Carter warned her not to demand too many last-minute wedding upgrades because Donovan's accountants were already asking questions. The personal betrayal was equally clear. Their messages documented a 6-month affair in hotel rooms paid for through one of the pass-through companies. Photographs recovered by the provider placed them together on nights Chelsea had told Preston she was attending bridal events. Metadata tied the images to the same accounts used to discuss the transfers. I did not celebrate when the files appeared. I verified them. My analysts compared the provider timestamps with hotel records, foundation logins, and bank transactions. Every independent source aligned. When Carter wrote that he had released another $50,000, the accounting server showed his credential approving a duplicate grant. The bank showed the money leaving. The offshore record showed it arriving. A hotel access record placed Chelsea with him that evening. The case no longer depended on a single suspicious clue or on my word as her sister. It rested on multiple sources that confirmed one another. The legal safeguards slowed us down, but they also removed every weakness Chelsea could later exploit. Each forensic image was created twice by separate analysts. One analyst examined the working copy, while another verified the checksum against the untouched original. Screenshots were never treated as primary evidence because images could be challenged or manipulated. We preserved the underlying databases, access histories, and provider-certified records that generated them. When a transaction appeared on our visual timeline, I could point to the exact server event bank confirmation and account authorization behind it. I also disclosed my relationship to Chelsea in writing. Evelyn insisted on it, and I agreed. Vaughn had hired the firm under my professional surname without realizing his prospective daughter-in-law was my sister. Once the potential crime became clear, concealing that connection would have allowed the defense to accuse us of bias. Donovan reviewed the disclosure, consulted independent counsel, and confirmed that he wanted my firm to continue because the evidence had been independently preserved and my analysts had followed the same procedures used in every other case. A second forensic company was retained to spot-check our findings. Their preliminary review matched ours. The confirmation did not make the work emotionally easier. Each new record forced me to separate the sister I remembered from the suspect described by the evidence. I could not use family history as proof, and I could not dismiss proof because of family history. My only protection was discipline document what existed, ignore what I merely believed, and let independent records speak for themselves. Friday morning, 4 days after the steakhouse dinner, Evelyn convened a final legal review. Donovan's attorneys, the Foundation's general counsel, and the federal team examined our transaction map and chain of custody report. No one asked me to exaggerate the findings. No one needed to. The evidence established coordinated wire fraud, embezzlement, obstruction through the attempted device wipe and a personal conspiracy between Chelsea and Carter. The investigators were not prepared to make an arrest based solely on family drama at a wedding. They were preparing warrants supported by bank records provider returns and foundation evidence. Donovan was instructed not to warn either suspect before the agents secured the remaining accounts and devices. The wedding was scheduled for Saturday. The private rehearsal gathering would take place that evening at the Oak Brook Country Club. By late Friday afternoon, I had 2 separate files. The first was the formal master dossier for Donovan and law enforcement. It contained the verified banking records, provider returns, foundation logs, transaction map, and chain of custody documentation. Nothing in it depended on an illegal intrusion. The second was a heavily redacted family warning. It contained enough legitimate evidence to show my parents that Chelsea was in grave danger, but it excluded investigative methods, explicit photographs, and information covered by the federal inquiry. I was not authorized to give them the master file. I was giving them one last chance to stop encouraging Chelsea to walk into a public catastrophe. I inserted the redacted drive into a small protective case and closed my hand around it. For the first time all week, the investigation was complete enough that I could no longer pretend there might be an innocent explanation. Chelsea was not merely pretending to be wealthy. She and Carter had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from sick children, and every lawful record pointed directly to them. I held the redacted drive in my palm and felt the first real conflict of the week. The professional decision had already been made. Donovan, his attorneys, and the federal investigators possessed the lawful evidence. I could not conceal it, retract it, or trade it for a private family solution. Chelsea and Carter had crossed far beyond a dishonest engagement. They had stolen from a charitable foundation and attempted to erase company evidence. Whatever happened next would be decided by the victims, the courts, and the authorities. The personal decision was different. My parents still believed Chelsea was the flawless daughter about to elevate the Wilson name. They did not know that the bank accounts were restricted, that Carter's company device had been seized, or that the wedding was moving toward a criminal confrontation. I could allow them to discover everything in front of 400 guests, or I could offer one final warning without compromising the investigation. Evelyn had approved the redacted file on strict conditions. I could show it to Richard and Patricia, but I could not give them a copy to keep, reveal the timing of the warrants, or identify the sources protected by the federal inquiry. The file contained a limited transaction summary, Carter's documented role at the foundation, and several provider-certified messages establishing that Chelsea knew about the stolen money. It was enough to prove that the danger was real. It was not enough to help anyone flee. I stared at the drive, remembering every occasion when I had tried to earn my parents' protection. When they emptied my college savings for Chelsea's Dubai trip, I told myself they would repay it. When they mocked my clothes and dismissed my career, I told myself they simply did not understand me. At the steakhouse, when they agreed that I should disappear from the wedding, the last of those excuses had finally collapsed. I was not considering the warning because they deserved another chance. I was considering it because I wanted to know once and for all whether a verified truth placed directly in their hands could matter more than Chelsea's tears. I also understood the danger of confusing mercy with interference. If I told them too much, Richard would call Chelsea, Chelsea would call Carter, and both suspects might run. If I said too little, my parents would dismiss the warning as another jealous accusation. The only ethical path was narrow: show them enough to stop supporting the wedding, but nothing that could obstruct the investigation. For most of my life, I had solved family problems by absorbing the cost myself. I paid bills no one thanked me for. I kept secrets to preserve reputations that had never protected mine. I softened facts so Chelsea would not feel threatened, and accepted blame so Patricia could maintain the fantasy of a peaceful household. This warning would be different. I would not negotiate with their denial. I would present the truth once established, the consequence, and leave. That distinction mattered, because I was no longer approaching them as a daughter begging to be believed. I was approaching them as the only person in the family who understood what the next 24 hours could bring before sunrise the next morning. My personal phone vibrated across the desk. The message was from Richard. Chelsea has been crying all week because you refused to help with the flowers. You are a socially unfit disgrace. You are dead to us. Do not contact this family again. I read it slowly. All week. So Chelsea had continued retelling the office confrontation while my team traced the money she had stolen. My father had waited until the night before the wedding to issue his final punishment, as though removing me from a family that had already excluded me was the most devastating threat he could imagine. The message should have ended my hesitation. Instead, it made the choice clearer. I would not call and allow him to hang up. I would not send photographs he could dismiss as edited. I would place the authenticated summary in front of both parents and state the consequences plainly. If they still chose Chelsea, I would leave, knowing there was nothing left to save. I replied with only 5 words. We need to speak tonight. Richard did not answer. I shut down the workstation and walked into the executive suite attached to my office. The charcoal designer suit in my private closet was not a costume, and it was not an attempt to impress them. It was the clothing I wore when presenting findings to boards, attorneys, and federal investigators. For once, I would enter a family confrontation as the person I actually was, rather than the diminished version they preferred. I changed into the tailored wool suit, paired it with a white silk blouse, and secured my hair into a polished style. I fastened my silver watch and placed the redacted drive inside the inner pocket of my blazer, where it could not be taken without my consent. Before leaving, I called Evelyn. Tell me again what I can say. You may tell them that verified evidence links Chelsea and Carter to theft from the foundation, she replied. You may say that authorities are involved. Do not disclose the timing of any enforcement action, the location of preserved assets, or the contents of sealed records. You may show them the redacted summary, but do not leave the drive with them, and if they refuse, leave. Do not argue, and do not warn Chelsea directly. Her answer removed the last uncertainty. The private rehearsal gathering was being held at the Oak Brook Country Club, where my parents had maintained a membership for more than 20 years. The drive from the Loop to the suburbs took nearly an hour in the Friday rain. During that time, I rehearsed no accusations and imagined no dramatic revenge. I reviewed facts the way I would before any difficult client meeting. 6 months of duplicate payments. Hundreds of thousands of dollars diverted. Carter's foundation credentials. Chelsea's beneficial ownership of the offshore entity. Provider-certified messages coordinating the theft. A federal investigation already in motion. Those facts did not change depending on how loudly my parents denied them. The country club appeared beyond the iron gates, every window glowing against the storm. Inside, Chelsea was celebrating the final evening before the ceremony. She believed the wedding would secure everything she wanted: My parents believed they were standing one night away from permanent entrance into the Kensington world. Neither understood that the door had already closed. As I passed through the wrought iron gates, I touched the inside pocket of my blazer and confirmed that the drive was still there. I reminded myself one final time that I was not trying to rescue Chelsea from the law. I was testing whether my parents could recognize reality before it destroyed them in full public view the following morning, before absolutely everyone whose approval they had spent entire decades chasing. I pulled my powerful sports car right up to the front portico, completely ignoring the neat line of conservative luxury sedans waiting patiently in the valet queue. A young attendant hurried out into the freezing rain, holding a large black umbrella, offering a respectful, nervous nod as I stepped gracefully out of the low vehicle. I handed him the keys without a single word, dropping a folded, crisp $50 bill into his damp palm. I smoothed the lapels of my new tailored suit, took a deep breath of the cold evening air, and walked purposefully through the heavy oak doors. My family thought I was a failure, but they were about to discover exactly who I really was. The grand foyer of the Oak Brook Country Club smelled of fresh lilies and decades of polished money. A tuxedoed maitre d' stepped directly into my path with a polite but firm smile. He opened his mouth to ask for my invitation, but I simply looked right through him and kept walking. My sharp stiletto heels clicked rhythmically against the imported marble floor. I knew the layout of this sprawling building perfectly. For years, I had been dragged here for awkward holiday brunches and stuffy charity galas where my parents paraded Chelsea around like a prized show pony while introducing me as an afterthought. I marched past the main dining room and turned down the long, dimly lit corridor lined with antique oil paintings. The rich mahogany walls seemed to close in slightly, but my breathing remained perfectly steady. The plush, custom carpet absorbed the sound of my footsteps as I approached the heavy double doors of the Magnolia Room. This was their most exclusive private dining suite. Through the thick, polished wood, I could hear the muted sounds of crystal clinking and the low murmur of sophisticated, high society laughter. I placed my hands flat against the brass handles. I did not knock. I did not hesitate. I pushed both doors open with a forceful shove that sent them swinging wide into the room. The transformation was immediate. The polite chatter died in a rapid cascading wave of sudden silence. Heads turned one by one as the affluent guests registered the intrusion. The room was bathed in the warm amber glow of crystal chandeliers. Waiters in pristine white coats stood frozen holding silver trays of champagne flutes. The Kensington family occupied the far side of the room, completely oblivious to the venomous snake they were welcoming into their lineage. Preston Kensington stood near the fireplace looking genuinely handsome and entirely foolish. Beside him stood Chelsea, wearing a breathtaking emerald green silk gown that draped flawlessly over her figure. Her head was thrown back in mid-laugh, but the sound died abruptly in her throat when her eyes locked onto mine. A flash of pure, unfiltered panic shattered her carefully crafted mask before she quickly replaced it with an expression of wounded confusion. Donovan himself was not among them. A waiter near the door quietly explained that the Kensington patriarch had been called into the club's private library by his attorneys and had ordered that no one disturb him. That absence was the only reason I could enter without my professional identity being exposed in front of the room. Preston had never met me, and the rest of his relatives knew my firm only through Donovan's counsel. To them, I was simply Chelsea's unwanted sister arriving in the middle of an important family event. My mother, Patricia, was seated at a round table near the center of the room. When she saw me standing in the doorway, her face drained of all color. She let out a sharp, audible gasp and raised a trembling hand to cover her mouth. Her eyes darted frantically toward the Kensingtons, terrified that my mere presence would somehow taint their flawless evening. Then my father stood up. Richard pushed his heavy wooden chair back so violently that it screeched against the polished hardwood floor. His face turned a deep, mottled shade of purple, and the veins in his neck bulged against his starched white collar. He had explicitly forbidden me from ever contacting this family again, and here I was, standing boldly in the center of his ultimate social triumph. He took a heavy step toward me, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. He opened his mouth to unleash a torrent of hushed, furious abuse. I did not give him the chance to speak a single word. I locked my eyes directly onto his, projecting a cold, unwavering dominance that stopped him dead in his tracks. I raised my hand and pointed a single commanding finger toward the open doorway. My voice was pitched low, but it carried clearly across the quiet space. "We are going to step out into the hallway right now," I instructed, projecting absolute authority. "Both of you. Do not make a scene in front of your new friends." My mother looked at my father, her chest heaving with anxious breaths. My father stared at me, his jaw working furiously as he weighed his options. He knew that causing a massive public scene would ruin the sophisticated atmosphere he so desperately craved. With a stiff, furious jerk of his head, he signaled to my mother. Patricia stood up on shaky legs, smoothing her expensive dress with frantic, nervous energy. They walked toward the doorway, their faces tight with suppressed rage. I stepped back into the corridor and allowed them to pass before reaching out and pulling the heavy mahogany doors firmly shut behind us. We were now completely isolated in the quiet, opulent hallway. My father spun around to face me, his voice a vicious, hissing whisper. "What is wrong with you, Madeline?" he demanded, stepping aggressively into my personal space. "I specifically told you that you were dead to us. You are completely ruining the most important night of your sister's life. You need to turn around and walk out those doors before I have security throw you out onto the street." My mother wrung her hands together, tears of profound embarrassment welling in her eyes. "How could you be so incredibly selfish?" she whimpered, her voice shaking with genuine distress. "Chelsea has worked so hard for this perfect life. Why must you always try to drag her down just because you are miserable and alone?" I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply reached into the tailored pocket of my charcoal blazer and pulled out the sleek black encrypted flash drive. I held the small metal device up between us, letting it catch the dim light of the hallway sconces. I kept my hand perfectly steady as I looked back and forth between my furious father and my weeping mother. "Mom, Dad, you need to look at this right now," I said, my voice dropping to a serious, uncompromising register. "This is not about a floral arrangement, and this is definitely not about my jealousy. I am trying to save you from complete destruction." My father glared at the flash drive, his thick gray eyebrows pulling together in a harsh scowl. "What kind of sick game are you playing, Madeline?" he sneered, refusing to look away from my face. I took a slow breath, letting the brutal reality of the situation hang in the air for a fraction of a second before delivering the final blow. "Chelsea is committing federal wire fraud against the Kensingtons," I stated, clearly, enunciating every single word so there could be no misunderstanding. "She has been actively siphoning hundreds of thousands of dollars out of their family charity foundation and routing it into hidden offshore shell accounts. If she walks down that aisle tomorrow, she will go to federal prison, and this entire family will be publicly destroyed." The sheer magnitude of my statement hit them like physical force. The color rapidly drained from my father's furious face, replacing his purple rage with a sickly pale shock. My mother let out a small, choked sob, her hands flying up to grip the pearls resting against her collarbone. They stared at the small black flash drive in my outstretched hand, suddenly realizing that my presence here was not a petty act of sibling rivalry. Richard swallowed hard, his hand trembling slightly as he slowly reached out to take the drive from my fingers. Just as his fingertips brushed the cold metal, the heavy mahogany doors to the Magnolia Room burst violently open. Chelsea practically fell into the hallway, her emerald gown sweeping wildly around her ankles. She threw her hands over her face and let out a loud, dramatic wail, crying perfectly manufactured tears as she threw herself toward our parents. Chelsea buried her face into our mother's shoulder, her frame shaking with physical exertion. "She is trying to sabotage me again," she wailed. The sound was designed specifically to trigger our parents' protective instincts. She pointed a manicured finger at my chest, her blue eyes swimming with tears. "I saw her standing there with that little drive," she cried out, breaking with precision. "She has been threatening me all week, telling me she was going to ruin everything. She has photoshopped fake bank records because she is a jealous, lonely spinster. She is making up horrible lies to destroy my wedding." My mother wrapped her arms around Chelsea, smoothing her hair with frantic motions. The accusation should have been laughable. I was the chief executive officer of a highly respected cybersecurity firm. The idea that I would Photoshop bank statements out of jealousy was a staggering insult to my intelligence. But logic had never been welcome in my family dynamic. Patricia glared at me with horror and absolute disgust. Without bothering to look at the flash drive, she lunged forward. Her hand swung out in a sudden, violent arc. The slap of her palm against my wrist echoed in the quiet hallway. The impact knocked the USB drive from my fingers. It hit the hard marble floor with a sharp metallic clatter, coming to rest against the mahogany molding. I lowered my hand, the skin stinging slightly from the contact. I looked from the device up to my mother's furious face. "You are sick, Madeline," Patricia screamed, her voice entirely devoid of the high society grace she had been projecting. Her chest heaved with panicked breaths as she pulled Chelsea closer. "You are so desperate for attention, you would invent crimes to ruin your sister's happiness. You have always been bitter, but this is a new low, even for you. Coming to her rehearsal dinner with these insane, malicious lies? You need serious psychiatric help. We should have committed you years ago instead of humoring your difficult personality." I stood perfectly still, letting her toxic words wash over me. I had internalized their brutal criticisms for my entire life, constantly wondering if my quiet nature made me a difficult person. I had spent hours in therapy trying to understand why I was never good enough to earn their respect. But watching my mother defend a woman stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars from pediatric cancer patients, I felt our familial bond dissolve. There was no pain left. There was only a profound, freezing emptiness. My father stepped forward, completely eclipsing my mother and Chelsea. He moved directly into my personal space, using his height and broad shoulders in an attempt to physically intimidate me. I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath. His face was mere inches from mine, his features twisted into a mask of pure contempt. He looked at me not as a daughter, but as a highly infectious disease that needed to be eradicated. "You are mentally unstable," Richard snarled, his voice a low growl, carrying far more menace than my mother's screaming. He pointed a thick finger at my face to punctuate his harsh words. "I am done playing these games with you. If you ever come near us again, I will have you arrested for harassment. I will personally ensure your little computer business is destroyed. You will never set foot in our home again. You will not attend this wedding tomorrow, and you will not speak the Kensington name. Now turn around and get out of this club before I call the police and have you dragged out." He stood there, breathing heavily, expecting me to shrink away in tears. He expected the quiet, obedient Madeline who always apologized. He expected the daughter who craved his validation to beg for forgiveness and retreat. He did not realize the woman standing before him was immune to his hollow threats. I did not break eye contact. I did not flinch. I did not offer a word of defense. The heavy silence stretched between us. I lowered my gaze to the marble floor where the discarded USB drive rested against the mahogany molding. It had never contained a way to erase Chelsea's crimes or stop the federal inquiry. That decision was already beyond my control. It had offered my parents something more limited, but still valuable, a chance to cancel the ceremony, stop defending her, and avoid attaching themselves publicly to a fraud they did not understand. They had chosen not to look. They had chosen the beautiful lie over the verified truth. I raised my head and stared dead into my father's eyes. The cold certainty in my gaze finally made him falter. A brief flicker of unease crossed his face as he realized I was not reacting the way I was supposed to. "I tried to save you," I said, my voice dangerously quiet and devoid of emotion. "Remember that." I did not wait for his response. I did not look at my mother or the sobbing predator clinging to her. I simply turned around and walked away. The sharp click of my stiletto heels against the marble floor marked the final steps of my departure. I pushed open the oak doors and stepped out into the freezing rain. The valet saw me approaching and scrambled out with an umbrella, but I waved him off. The cold downpour felt incredible against my skin, washing away the suffocating atmosphere. I handed the attendant my ticket and waited until he pulled my black sports car up to the portico. I slid into the driver's seat and pulled the door shut, sealing myself inside the quiet cabin. The drumming of the heavy rain against the glass roof provided a calming rhythm. I sat in the darkness, watching the blurry lights through the water-streaked windshield. Inside, my parents were comforting Chelsea, assuring her that her perfect wedding would proceed exactly as planned. They were completely unaware of the hellfire about to rain down upon their manufactured lives. They had made their choice, and now I had to make mine. I reached over and picked up my encrypted titanium laptop. I rested the device on the console and flipped open the screen. The biometric scanner read my fingerprint, illuminating the cabin with a white glow. I connected to my agency's secure network, utilizing an encrypted tunnel to ensure privacy. I bypassed the redacted files and opened the secure master folder. The unredacted forensic dossier sat waiting on the screen. It contained every single piece of evidence we had pulled from Chelsea's unencrypted device. It held the complete offshore routing numbers, the Cayman Island account details, and the undeniable proof of the stolen charity funds. It contained the hundreds of graphic text messages between Chelsea and Carter, explicitly detailing their plans to siphon the Kensington fortune. It held the high-definition photographs and videos proving their 6-month affair. It was a complete, undeniable package of absolute destruction. I opened my email client and drafted a new message directed to the private email address of Donovan Kensington. I attached the massive encrypted file to the message. I did not write a lengthy explanation or offer any pleasantries. I simply typed a single sentence into the body of the email. "Here is the comprehensive background report on Chelsea Wilson." I looked at the send button glowing brightly on the screen. My father's cruel words echoed in the quiet cabin of my car. "You are mentally unstable. You are dead to us." I reached out and pressed the trackpad. I hit send on the fully unredacted, devastating forensic dossier directly to Donovan Kensington. For several seconds after the message left my outbox, I remained motionless behind the wheel. The status line changed from uploading to delivered, then displayed the verification code, proving that Donovan's server had received the same encrypted package my firm had approved that afternoon. The truth had crossed the final distance between discovery and consequence. I did not feel triumphant. I felt the clean, cold finality of a door locking behind me. There would be no more private warnings and no second redacted drive. My parents had been offered enough evidence to stop the wedding and protect themselves from public humiliation. They had answered by calling me unstable, threatening my company, and choosing Chelsea's performance over the truth in my hand. I closed the laptop but did not start the engine. Through the rain-streaked windshield, the illuminated windows of the country club glowed against the darkness. Somewhere inside, my mother was probably smoothing Chelsea's hair and assuring her that I had always been jealous. My father was likely ordering another drink and congratulating himself for protecting the daughter who reflected the image he wanted the world to see. For one brief moment, I considered walking back inside and asking Preston to step into the hallway. The impulse was not about saving Chelsea. It was about sparing an innocent man from reaching the altar without knowing that his fiancée and his best friend had betrayed him. But that decision no longer belonged to me. Donovan was the client, the foundation was the victim, and federal investigators were already controlling the criminal portion of the case. A personal confrontation could alert Carter, trigger the destruction of evidence, or give Chelsea time to move money. The most responsible thing I could do was remain inside the professional chain we had established. I started the engine and drove back toward the city. When I reached the office shortly after midnight, only the overnight security staff and 2 analysts remained. Marcus looked up from his workstation as I entered the operational floor. "Did they listen?" he asked. "No." His expression tightened, but he did not ask for details. I entered my office, removed my wet coat, and opened the case management system. The master dossier had already been locked under dual authorization. I added a memorandum documenting the time and method of delivery to Donovan, then attached a short note explaining that a separate redacted warning had been offered to my parents and rejected. Evelyn reviewed the note remotely and approved it for the privileged legal file. At 12:46 a.m., Donovan's server generated an automated receipt confirming that the package had been opened. 11 minutes later, his general counsel sent a secure message. "Materials received. Do not contact either subject. Maintain preservation status. We will coordinate with investigators before the ceremony." The wording was restrained, but it told me everything. Donovan had not dismissed the report as family gossip. His lawyers were treating it as an active crisis. My personal phone began vibrating across the desk. The family group chat had erupted with photographs from the country club. Chelsea posted a picture of herself standing between our parents beneath the chandeliers, smiling as though the confrontation in the hallway had never happened. Her caption thanked everyone for supporting her during what she called an emotionally difficult evening caused by a disturbed relative. My father replied almost immediately, "Tomorrow will prove who truly belongs in this family." For years, words like that had kept me awake. I would replay them, search for hidden meanings, and wonder what version of myself might finally earn his approval. That night, the sentence produced no shame. It only confirmed that my parents were still constructing a reality in which Chelsea was innocent and I existed as the convenient villain. I muted the conversation. A second secure message arrived just after 1 in the morning. The Foundation's bank had completed emergency restrictions on the suspicious accounts, and federal agents had scheduled the seizure of Carter's company devices before he could leave the city. No arrest had yet been made. The investigators needed the final warrants signed and wanted the remaining suspects to believe the wedding was proceeding normally. That explained the careful silence. Before leaving, I also requested an independent copy of the delivery receipt from our outside evidence custodian. That small step mattered. If Chelsea later claimed I had changed the dossier after sending it, 3 separate systems would show the same file, the same checksum, and the same delivery time. I was no longer protecting myself from my family's insults. I was protecting the case from the defense strategy their attorneys would inevitably build around my relationship to her. Donovan was not ignoring the evidence. He was giving the authorities time to close every exit. I checked the evidence server one final time, confirmed that the original network record and all verified returns remained intact, then instructed the system to require 2 executives before any file could be exported. By the time I shut down my workstation, it was nearly 3 in the morning. The rain had weakened to a mist when I returned home. I rode the private elevator to my penthouse and stepped into the dark living room without turning on the lights. Chicago stretched beneath the windows, distant and quiet. I thought about the approved conversation list Chelsea had slid across the steakhouse table. I thought about my father laughing when I reached for the dinner bill, and my mother calmly explaining that disappearing from the wedding was the most supportive thing I could do. They had believed exclusion was a punishment because they assumed I needed their world more than they needed me. They had been wrong. My life was not waiting outside a cathedral door. It was here, in the company I had built, the home I had earned, and the quiet that belonged entirely to me. The wedding could continue or collapse. My parents could apologize or curse my name. None of it would alter the records or return me to the role they had assigned me. Before placing my personal phone in a drawer, I saw 9 missed calls from my mother and 3 from my father. None included a voicemail. They were not calling to apologize. They were calling because the bank restrictions or legal inquiries had already begun disturbing the fantasy they were protecting. I powered the phone down. Sleep came slowly, but when it arrived, it was deep and dreamless. By morning, I had made one final decision. I would not spend Chelsea's wedding day beside a phone waiting for my family to demand another rescue. I booked a private spa suite downtown, packed only my secure agency tablet, and left the rest of their chaos behind. The heavy, freezing rain of Friday night eventually surrendered to a brilliantly clear Saturday morning. The day Chelsea had spent her entire life ruthlessly scheming for had finally arrived. I was nowhere near the sprawling estate helping her into her custom designer gown. I was miles away, safely wrapped in a plush, heated robe, sitting alone in the private relaxation suite of an exclusive downtown luxury spa. Soft instrumental music played from hidden speakers, and the air smelled heavily of calming eucalyptus and fresh lavender. It was a jarring, perfectly engineered contrast to the suffocating, toxic tension of the country club. I settled deep into a cushioned lounge chair and stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the waking city. My personal cell phone sat at the bottom of my assigned spa locker, completely powered down. I had absolutely no desire to receive the inevitable barrage of furious phone calls or desperate demanding voicemails from my father. They had made their choice when they slapped the redacted evidence out of my hands and ordered me out of their lives. I was honoring their request with absolute silence. I had brought only my secure agency-issued tablet into the relaxation room, resting it lightly on my lap. While my personal number was disconnected, my tablet was currently mirroring the massive extended family group chat. My parents could not reach me directly, but the oblivious aunts, cousins, and distant relatives who had not been banned from my life were currently providing a continuous real-time commentary of the unfolding disaster. I reached over and picked up a tall glass of iced cucumber water from the small teak table beside my chair. I took a slow, refreshing sip as the screen of my tablet lit up with a rapid succession of incoming notifications. The wedding was scheduled to begin at exactly 11 in the morning at the most prestigious cathedral in the city. It was now 15 minutes past the hour. The messages rolling in from my cousin Sarah and my Aunt Linda painted a vivid picture of the mounting confusion inside the massive stone church. Sarah sent a message complaining that the string quartet had been playing the same classical prelude loop for over 30 minutes. She noted that the floral arrangements looked absolutely stunning, but the temperature inside the cathedral felt incredibly stifling. Aunt Linda chimed in immediately after, wondering why the heavy wooden doors at the back of the church were still tightly closed. She sent a grainy, zoomed-in photograph of the front pews. The image was slightly blurred, but the body language of the people sitting there spoke volumes. The Kensington family occupied the entire first row. They were not smiling. They were not mingling or politely turning around to greet the arriving guests. Donovan Kensington sat perfectly rigid, staring straight ahead, with a posture that radiated absolute lethal fury. His wife sat beside him, clutching a small silver evening bag with white-knuckled intensity. The sheer collective anger radiating from their side of the aisle was palpable, even through a compressed digital photograph. I set the glass of cucumber water back down and scrolled further down the chat log. Another cousin posted a frantic update from her vantage point near the side altar. She had a direct view of the groomsmen waiting in the shadowy alcove near the vestry. According to her rapid text messages, Preston Kensington was nowhere to be seen. The rest of the groomsmen were standing in an awkward, silent circle, but Carter Vance looked completely different. He was leaning heavily against a stone pillar, his face drained of all color. My cousin noted that Carter looked like he was about to be physically sick, right there on the polished marble floor. He kept checking his phone, his hands visibly shaking, and loosening his silk tie as if he suddenly could not breathe. I watched the text messages continue to flood the screen, feeling a deep, profound sense of calm wash over my tired mind. Carter knew. He had undoubtedly tried to contact Chelsea or check the offshore accounts this morning and discovered that the walls were rapidly closing in. The frozen accounts and the deafening silence from the Kensington family were the ultimate indicators of his impending doom. I took another slow sip of my water, enjoying the crisp, cool taste against my throat. I had spent my entire life feeling small and insignificant in the shadow of my sister. Now I was sitting in quiet luxury, watching her meticulously constructed empire burn to the ground, purely because I had finally chosen to deliver the truth. Another message arrived from Aunt Linda. She had moved toward the rear of the cathedral to find better reception, and noticed two unmarked dark vehicles parked across the street. Men in plain suits were speaking with the Kensington security director near a side entrance. Linda assumed they were additional protection for the wealthy guests. I knew better than to speculate in the group chat. A photograph from Sarah showed my parents seated near the aisle. Patricia kept turning toward the doors, whispering urgently to Richard. My father held his phone beneath the program and refreshed the screen every few seconds. The confident couple who had ordered me out of the country club now looked as though they were waiting for an approaching storm they could not identify. Chelsea appeared in a short video recorded inside the bridal room. She was smiling for her followers and complaining playfully about the delay. Her voice remained bright, but she repeatedly asked whether anyone had seen Carter. Behind her, a bridesmaid tried to calm Patricia, who was demanding that the ceremony begin before some jealous person created another problem. I did not respond. Instead, I opened the secure case dashboard. The foundation evidence remained locked. The bank preservation orders were active. Carter's company devices had been transferred to federal custody, and the provider records were marked received and verified. A new status line indicated that the final warrants had been approved less than 20 minutes earlier. The case was no longer balanced on a report I had written. It had moved into institutions Chelsea could not intimidate, and systems my parents could not dismiss as family drama. For a moment, I rested the tablet against my knees and listened to the quiet music in the spa. The eucalyptus scent, the warm robe, and the muted city far below felt almost unreal. My entire childhood had trained me to run toward Chelsea's emergencies, absorb the damage, and help restore the illusion that she had done nothing wrong. Every notification on the screen invited me back into that role. I stayed seated. At 11:27, Sarah typed that the side doors near the altar had opened. Several Kensington attorneys entered and spoke quietly to Donovan. Preston was still absent. Carter had stopped checking his phone and was now staring toward the nearest exit. Then the family chat abruptly went silent. Suddenly, the steady stream of text messages vanished from my screen. The tablet chimed with a sharp, distinct tone, indicating an incoming secure communication. A high-priority encryption override completely hijacked the display, blocking out the family chat interface. A red notification banner flashed across the top of the glass reading, "Incoming secure video transmission." The caller identification displayed a single name, Donovan Kensington. I carefully set my water glass down and adjusted the collar of my plush white robe. I sat up perfectly straight and tapped the glowing green icon to accept the transmission. The screen immediately split, displaying my own calm reflection in the corner and filling the main view with the imposing face of my billionaire client. Donovan Kensington was seated in the back of a moving sedan, dressed in a dark formal suit and silver tie. The lines around his mouth were rigid, but the anger in his eyes was controlled rather than impulsive. "Madeline," he said, "I reviewed the complete package with counsel before dawn. The independent forensic team confirmed your transaction map. The Foundation Bank confirmed the transfers, and federal investigators now have provider-certified records linking Chelsea and Carter to the beneficiary accounts." I nodded. "Have the remaining assets been secured?" "The domestic accounts are frozen. The Cayman institution received a preservation order through the appropriate authorities. Carter's Foundation laptop has been seized, and the attempted remote wipe is now part of the obstruction case." He paused, looking briefly older than he had during any of our previous calls. "I showed Preston the verified evidence an hour ago. He saw the bank records first. Then he read the messages between Chelsea and the man he has called his brother since childhood. My son is devastated, but he understands that the evidence is genuine." I kept my voice professional. "The agents instructed us not to alert either subject before the warrants were secured." "They have been secured," Donovan replied. "Carter will be detained when he tries to leave the cathedral. Chelsea will be taken into custody after the ceremony is stopped and the guests are moved away from the main entrance. The agents did not want an arrest inside a crowded sanctuary unless she attempted to flee." That explained the pale groomsmen, the delays, and the security gathering near the side aisles. "What does Preston intend to do?" I asked. Donovan's jaw tightened. "I advised him to cancel the event privately. He refused. 400 people were invited to witness Chelsea promise loyalty, while she and Carter planned to rob this family. Preston believes those same witnesses should hear why the marriage will not happen. I told him he may expose the documents, but private security has orders to intervene the moment anyone becomes physical. His certainty did not erase the risk. Public confrontation can become unpredictable." "I know," he said quietly. "So does Preston. But after what they did, this is the only decision he still feels belongs to him." Donovan straightened and returned to business. "Your firm will receive the success fee in full, along with a substantial bonus. More important, the Kensington companies are extending your agency a permanent cybersecurity and forensic services agreement. You did not merely identify a dishonest fiancé. You protected the Foundation, preserved admissible evidence, and prevented my family from accusing the wrong person based on emotion. Thank you for your trust, Mr. Kensington." He leaned closer to the camera. Behind him, I could hear the faint sound of bells. "One more thing. Turn on the local news. The guest live stream has already reached the press, and Preston has just walked toward the altar." The screen went completely black as Donovan Kensington severed the encrypted connection. I sat in the profound silence of the luxury spa suite, processing his final, chilling instruction. I reached for the polished silver remote resting on the teak side table and aimed it at the massive flat-screen television mounted against the far wall. The display flickered to life, filling the room with the bright colors of the local news. A breaking news banner flashed across the screen in bold red letters. The anchor desk was empty. The network had bypassed their standard morning programming to broadcast a direct live feed from a chaotic scene unfolding downtown. The camera zoomed in on the towering facade of the city cathedral. A swarm of reporters clustered against the heavy iron gates. I turned up the volume, listening to the field reporter attempting to speak over the roaring crowd. She announced that a massive disturbance had occurred inside the anticipated Kensington wedding. A guest had managed to bypass security protocols and broadcast a live video stream of the ceremony directly to social media. The unauthorized footage was spreading across the internet. The news station had acquired the raw video and began playing the clip. I sat forward, gripping my cold glass of cucumber water. The television transitioned to the shaky perspective of a cell phone camera inside the grand sanctuary. The audio was slightly muffled, but the visuals were clear. The cathedral was a display of unimaginable wealth. 400 elite guests sat in the polished pews, dressed in formal attire. Towering arrangements of white roses cascaded down every surface. The pipe organ played a bridal chorus. The camera panned, capturing the grand entrance. Chelsea appeared perfectly framed within the doorway. She walked slowly down the long white runner. Her custom gown trailed behind her, glittering with thousands of crystals. Even through her delicate veil, her triumphant smile was unmistakable. She was practically vibrating with victory. She believed she had won. She believed she had navigated her web of lies to cement her status. She glided past the guests, soaking in the admiration. The camera shifted toward the altar where Preston Kensington stood waiting. He looked incredibly sharp in his tuxedo, but his posture was rigid. He stood with his feet planted firmly and his jaw clenched. To his immediate right stood Carter Vance. The designated best man looked physically ill. His complexion was a ghastly shade of gray, and sweat glistened on his forehead. Carter kept shifting nervously, darting frantic glances toward the side doors. He knew the trap was closing, but he was surrounded by witnesses. Chelsea finally reached the altar. The organ music swelled and faded into absolute silence. The priest stepped forward, ready to begin. He opened his mouth to speak, but Preston raised his hand to stop him. The congregation held their breath, sensing a sudden shift in the atmosphere. Preston did not look at the priest. He did not look at his family. He locked his burning eyes onto the woman he intended to marry. Chelsea tilted her head, her triumphant smile faltering as confusion washed over her features. Preston reached inside the pocket of his tuxedo jacket. He did not pull out a ring. He withdrew a thick stack of papers. He held the documents up, his hands trembling with heartbreak and rage. I recognized the formatting immediately. They were the unredacted offshore bank logs, the explicit text messages, and the photographs I had securely transmitted hours prior. Preston thrust the stack of evidence directly into Chelsea's face. He did not speak softly. He did not preserve the dignity of the space. He raised his voice, projecting his devastation to the back row. He demanded to know how long she had been sleeping with his best man while stealing from cancer patients. The words hit the cathedral like a physical bomb. A horrified gasp erupted from the 400 elite guests. The camera jerked as the guest flinched in shock. Chelsea let out a piercing scream that shattered the sophisticated atmosphere. Her carefully constructed facade disintegrated, revealing the predator underneath. She lunged forward, attempting to snatch the evidence away from him. She screamed a stream of vile obscenities, forgetting her audience. She physically attacked the man she was supposed to marry, grabbing his lapels and tearing in a blind panic. Chelsea's expression twisted. Before Preston could lower the documents, she slapped him across the mouth. His head snapped sideways, and a red mark appeared along his cheek. She struck again, clawing at his face as she screamed that he was weak and that the evidence was fake. Preston caught one wrist, but Chelsea tore free and lunged toward the papers. His open hand moved once. The slap landed across Chelsea's cheek with a sharp report, amplified by the officiant's microphone. Preston stepped back, while private security rushed between them. Chelsea stumbled over the train of her gown and collapsed onto the marble steps among the bank logs and printed messages. My mother rose from the front pew, saw Carter being restrained near the side aisle, and fainted into my father's arms. Carter tried to run, but 2 guards tackled him before he reached the vestry door. The live stream shook violently, catching fragments of Chelsea screaming, Preston standing motionless, and Donovan signaling the agents waiting outside. Then, the feed cut to black. I sat back in my plush chair, the cool leather soothing against my skin. The news anchor reappeared, looking genuinely stunned as she struggled to maintain composure while describing the unprecedented implosion of the wedding. I reached down and picked up the silver key to my spa locker. I walked across the relaxation room and opened the metal door. My personal cell phone was resting exactly where I had left it. I picked up the device and pressed the power button as the operating system slowly booted up. The screen illuminated brightly against the dim lighting. Instantly, the device froze, locking up under the crushing weight of the incoming data. The notification counter exploded rapidly, climbing past 50, then jumping past 100. I had exactly 147 missed calls from my parents. The text message preview scrolled endlessly across the locked screen, displaying an escalating timeline of absolute, unhinged panic. They demanded to know where I was. They ordered me to answer the phone. They begged for my help. I slowly unlocked the device and navigated directly to my voicemail inbox. The final recorded message was from my father. The timestamp indicated it had been left just minutes ago while I was watching the news broadcast. I pressed play and lifted the speaker to my ear. Richard Wilson did not sound like the arrogant, commanding patriarch who had threatened me in the country club hallway the previous night. He sounded small, broken, and completely consumed by sheer animalistic terror. His voice was trembling violently, his breath hitching with genuine panic. "Madeline, the FBI, is at the reception venue," he cried out, the sound of loud, chaotic shouting echoing clearly in the background. "They are taking Chelsea in handcuffs right now. Please, you work with computers. You have to hack in and prove these documents are fake. You have to save your sister." I slowly lowered the phone from my ear, ending the playback and dropping the heavy device back into my leather bag. I looked out the spa window at the bright morning sky, feeling a profound sense of absolute peace. They had made their ruthless choices, and now they were facing the devastating consequences. I powered down my personal cell phone and slipped it into my leather tote bag alongside my encrypted agency tablet. I had absolutely no intention of listening to another frantic voicemail or reading another unhinged text message from the people who had banished me. The spa attendant offered me a warm eucalyptus towel as I checked out, but I declined. I tipped her generously and walked out into the crisp downtown air. The short drive to my residence felt entirely different today. The heavy, suffocating weight of seeking my parents' approval and never measuring up to their impossible standards had finally been lifted from my shoulders. I pulled my sports car into the secure garage of my condominium building and took the private elevator directly up to the top floor. My penthouse was a quiet sanctuary of minimalist design, featuring expansive glass walls that offered an unobstructed view of the city skyline. I spent the remainder of the evening in total silence. I cooked a simple dinner, poured myself a generous glass of expensive red wine, and watched the city lights flicker to life far below. For the first time in my entire life, I did not feel a single trace of anxiety about my standing within the Wilson family. I went to bed early and slept incredibly soundly through the night, completely undisturbed by the catastrophic public implosion of Chelsea's manufactured fairy tale. The following morning arrived with bright, streaming sunlight pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I woke up feeling remarkably refreshed and walked into my spacious chef's kitchen to brew a fresh pot of artisanal coffee. I was just pouring the rich, dark liquid into my favorite ceramic mug when the secure intercom mounted on the wall buzzed sharply. I pressed the communication button, expecting a routine delivery notification from the front desk. Instead, the voice of Daniel, my building's head concierge, came through the speaker sounding uncharacteristically tense and highly professional. He apologized profusely for the early intrusion and informed me that there was a highly agitated couple in the grand lobby, aggressively demanding to see me. According to Daniel, the man and woman had illegally bypassed the exterior security gates by closely tailgating a resident's vehicle into the private courtyard. They were currently refusing to leave the premises, causing a significant disturbance, and were threatening to call the police if I did not come down immediately. They aggressively identified themselves as my parents. I took a slow, steadying breath, letting the warm steam from my coffee wash over my face. I told Daniel to keep them entirely contained in the visitor waiting area and explicitly instructed him to have 2 building security guards stand by. I promised him I would be right down to handle the situation. I did not rush. I took my time changing into a perfectly tailored charcoal gray pantsuit that radiated absolute professional authority. I slipped on black stiletto heels, picked up my coffee mug, and took the private elevator down to the ground floor. When the polished steel doors slid open with a soft chime, the grand lobby stretched out before me. The space was an intimidating display of modern luxury, featuring imported Italian marble floors and massive crystal chandeliers hanging from the vaulted ceiling. In the center of this pristine environment stood my parents. They looked utterly unrecognizable. The pristine, high society veneer they had meticulously maintained for decades had completely evaporated overnight. My father was wearing the same wrinkled dress shirt from the rehearsal dinner, his tie missing, and his expensive suit jacket severely rumpled. His eyes were bloodshot and frantic, darting around the lobby with paranoid intensity. My mother looked even worse. Patricia's perfectly styled hair was flattened and severely disheveled. Her makeup was severely smudged around her eyes, leaving dark, hollow streaks running down her pale cheeks. She was physically trembling, clutching her designer handbag against her chest like a protective shield. The moment they spotted me, walking confidently across the marble floor, my mother let out a loud, desperate wail that echoed off the high ceilings. Madeline Patricia sobbed, stumbling forward before 2 broad-shouldered security guards smoothly stepped into her path, firmly blocking her advance. She pressed her hands to her face, her shoulders heaving with hysterical, panicked weeping. "It is an absolute nightmare, Madeline. Chelsea is in a federal holding cell." They took her away in handcuffs right in front of everyone at the reception venue. The entire city saw it happen. My father pushed his way forward, stopping just short of the formidable security guards. His face was twisted with a complex mixture of sheer terror and misplaced righteous anger. "The Kensingtons are trying to completely destroy us," Richard demanded, his voice cracking with profound desperation. "Donovan Kensington hired some ruthless corporate cybersecurity firm. They fabricated an entire mountain of evidence against your sister. They manufactured fake bank logs and photoshopped disgusting graphic images to frame Chelsea for embezzlement. They set her up to take the absolute fall for Carter Vance." My mother nodded frantically, fresh tears streaming down her ruined makeup. "Yes, they set her up perfectly. They made it look exactly like she was stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars from that pediatric cancer charity. The federal agents would not even let us speak to her. They just dragged her away in her wedding dress. You have to help us, Madeline. You work with computers. You have those little IT skills. You have to hack into their network and prove these documents are completely fake. You have to clear her name before prosecutors move her from the holding facility to a federal detention center for the bond hearing." I stood perfectly still, letting their manic, delusional demands wash over me. The absolute audacity of their presence was staggering. Just 36 hours ago, my father had cornered me in a country club hallway, pointing a thick finger in my face and threatening to destroy my business. He had viciously ordered me out of his life and explicitly told me I was a mental patient. Now he was standing in the lobby of my building, begging for my specific technical expertise to save his golden child from the consequences of her own actions. Before I could process my mother's demand that I somehow hack a federal investigation, my father stepped closer and gripped the velvet rope. The magistrate refused to release her without a secured bond. Richard said, his voice dropping into a desperate command. Her attorneys say we may have to pledge $1 million in cash or property as collateral, and every asset we own is tied up in this wedding. You need to borrow against this condominium and provide the full security for the bond today. We have to get Chelsea out before the detention hearing. The sheer entitlement of his demand hung in the quiet lobby. He actually expected me to blindly mortgage my home to bail out a proven criminal who had just destroyed an innocent family. I looked directly at their panicked, terrified faces. I looked at the security guards, watching them with barely concealed disdain. I raised the ceramic mug too, took one deliberate sip, and set it carefully on the reception desk. The small sound of porcelain touching stone seemed unnaturally loud in the silent lobby. Then I looked directly at my father and finally told him the truth. I did not just work with computers, Dad, I said, my voice ringing with crystal clarity across the quiet expanse of the marble lobby. I own the elite cybersecurity firm the Kensingtons hired. I am the chief executive officer who personally handed Donovan Kensington the IP logs proving your golden child is a dangerous federal felon. The silence that followed my statement was absolute and suffocating. The background hum of the city traffic outside the heavy glass doors seemed to fade away completely, leaving only the sound of my parents' shallow, panicked breathing. Richard blinked rapidly, his bloodshot eyes staring at me as if I had just spoken a completely foreign language. He opened his mouth to issue another demand, or perhaps another unhinged insult, but the words died in his throat. Patricia froze her hands, hovering awkwardly near her chest, her ruined face twisting in utter confusion and deep denial. They were struggling to reconcile the pathetic failure of a daughter they had always imagined, with the woman standing before them in a designer pantsuit flanked by private security guards in a multi-million-dollar high-rise. "You are lying," my father finally stammered, his voice lacking all of its usual commanding resonance. "You run a little tech support business. You fix laptops and set up local networks for small regional offices. You are just a basic computer technician. You do not have the clearance or the executive access to get anywhere near a billionaire like Donovan Kensington. You could never afford this building." I took another sip of my coffee, enjoying the dark roast as I watched his fragile reality begin to fracture. "My firm holds top-tier federal security clearances, Dad. We handle elite cyber defense for Fortune 500 companies and private billionaires. Donating Kensington did not just hire some random tech support service to investigate his future daughter-in-law. He hired the absolute best apex predators in the entire industry. He hired me, and I did exactly what he paid me to do. I systematically dismantled every single lie Chelsea has ever told. I watched the profound realization hit Richard like a physical freight train. The arrogant posture he had maintained for decades finally collapsed. His broad shoulders slumped, and he took a shaky step backward, bumping into the velvet rope of the stanchion behind him. He was looking at the daughter he had spent 30 years calling low-class, unmotivated, and difficult. He was looking at the woman he had ordered out of his sight just last night. He suddenly understood that I was not a struggling employee desperately hoping to secure a loan on a modest condo. I was the multimillionaire mastermind who owned the very penthouse above their heads. I was the architect of their current living nightmare, and I held all the cards. Patricia let out a strangled gasp. "But she is your sister!" she cried out, her voice breaking into a high, panicked pitch. "How could you do this to your own flesh and blood? You fabricated those documents because you have always been insanely jealous of her beauty and her success. You framed her to ruin the best day of her life." "There was no fabrication, Patricia," I said, using her first name because the word mom no longer fit. "Chelsea left a trail through the Foundation's own systems. My team followed it. Under written authorization, the bank confirmed the transfers, and federal investigators obtained the private records through court orders. An independent forensic company verified our findings before anyone made an arrest. My father swallowed hard, the color draining from his face. Carter was not only Preston's best man, he was the Foundation's deputy treasurer and director of grant operations. He created duplicate payment requests, approved them beneath the internal review limit, and sent the money through intermediary accounts. Chelsea controlled the offshore company that received it. Their messages matched the dates, amounts, and account records. Even the attempt to erase Carter's company laptop was preserved. Patricia shook her head violently. "You did this because you hate her." "No," I replied. "I documented what she did because that was my job." The distinction seemed to frighten them more than anger would have. They had spent years believing every decision I made revolved around Chelsea. They could understand jealousy, competition, and resentment because those were the rules of the family they had created. They could not understand that I had built a professional life in which evidence mattered more than their version of me. I placed my coffee on the reception desk. The federal case does not depend on my opinion. It rests on foundation logs, bank confirmations, provider-certified records, and Carter's own credentials. I could disappear tomorrow, and the evidence would still exist. My mother's mouth opened, but no words came out. "The tragedy," I continued, "is that I tried to keep this from becoming a public catastrophe. Last night I brought you a redacted file. It excluded investigative methods, explicit photographs, and everything covered by the federal inquiry. It contained only enough verified information for you to understand that the wedding had to stop." Richard closed his eyes. He remembered reaching toward the drive before Chelsea burst into the hallway. He remembered Patricia striking my wrist and knocking it onto the marble. He remembered calling me unstable, while the only warning they would ever receive lay at his feet. "All you had to do was look," I said. 5 minutes, one file, one honest question. His shoulders sagged. "But you never opened it. Patricia knocked it out of my hand. You threatened to destroy my company and have me arrested. Then you ordered me out of the family." I let the silence settle before giving them the part they could not escape. When I returned to my car, I delivered the complete professional dossier to Donovan through the legal channel established for the investigation. By then, the bank had already preserved the suspicious accounts, and the authorities were verifying the evidence independently. "Your rejection did not create Chelsea's crimes. It only destroyed the last private opportunity you had to stop defending them." Patricia stared at me as though she could still force the moment backward through sheer denial. "You could retract it," she whispered. "You own the firm. I cannot retract bank records, court-authorized provider returns, or transactions Chelsea and Carter created themselves. Being the chief executive does not give me the power to erase reality." For the first time, Richard looked not angry, but hollow. He finally understood that the daughter he had dismissed as a low-level technician had offered him the only informed advice he had received all week, and that his contempt had made him incapable of hearing it. "You chose the performance," I said quietly. "Now you have to live with what was happening behind it." The sharp sound of Patricia's knees striking the polished Italian marble echoed loudly through the cavernous lobby. Her sudden physical collapse startled the few residents walking near the front desk, causing them to stop and stare. Patricia did not care about the audience. Her meticulously maintained social facade had completely shattered, leaving nothing but a desperate, terrified mother begging for salvation. She leaned forward awkwardly, her expensive designer handbag tumbling forgotten to the floor, as she reached out with violently trembling hands. Her manicured fingers grasped blindly at the air before catching the hem of my tailored wool coat. She gripped the premium fabric with a frantic, crushing strength, bunching the material in her fists as she looked up at me. Her face was a mask of smeared cosmetics and flowing tears. "You have to fix this, Madeline," she wailed, her voice cracking with raw, unfiltered panic. "You are her sister. You have to retract the report. You have to pick up your phone and call the federal agents. Tell them there was a massive mistake in your system. Tell them the data was corrupted or someone hacked into your firm to plant those files. You are the chief executive officer. They will listen to you. You can tell Donovan Kensington that the investigation was flawed. You have to pull the evidence back before they officially charge her. Please, Madeline, you are the only one who can stop this nightmare. We are your family. You cannot just leave your own flesh and blood locked inside a federal holding cell." I stared down at her clutching hands, feeling a profound sense of absolute revulsion. For 3 decades, this woman had stood silently by while my father systematically tore down my confidence and isolated me from the family. She had actively participated in my emotional exile, constantly reminding me that I lacked the grace, the beauty, and the fundamental worth of my younger sister. She had gladly reaped the benefits of Chelsea's deceitful maneuvering, turning a blind eye to the malicious destruction left in her wake. Now stripped of her country club armor and facing total financial and social ruin, she dared to invoke the sacred concept of sisterhood. The sheer hypocrisy of her pleading was physically nauseating. I looked at her tear-stained face and felt absolutely nothing. I braced my stance and took a sudden, forceful step backward. I ripped the hem of my coat out of her frantic grip with a sharp, violent pull. The sudden loss of contact sent Patricia pitching forward, her hands slapping against the cold marble floor to catch her balance. She gasped in shock at the physical rejection, staring up at me with wide, terrified eyes. I did not offer her a hand. I did not offer her a single shred of comfort. I looked down at her with eyes as cold and unforgiving as the stone beneath her knees. I adjusted the lapels of my jacket, smoothing out the wrinkled fabric where her desperate fingers had just been clutching. The air in the lobby felt incredibly still as I prepared to deliver the final, devastating blow to their manufactured reality. "You told me I was socially unfit for your high-class family," I stated, my voice resonating with smooth, icy precision. "You stood in that hallway last night and agreed with every single vile word Richard said. You actively supported the narrative that I was a bitter, unstable disappointment who simply could not handle the elevated circles you and Chelsea operated within. You wanted to be part of the absolute elite. You wanted the Kensington wealth, the unparalleled prestige, and the limitless power that came with their name. You were completely willing to sacrifice my sanity and my reputation to secure your place at their table. You made your choice, Patricia. You chose the beautiful, comfortable lie over the ugly, undeniable truth. You chose to protect a parasite. Now you get to experience how classy federal prison really is," I said, leaning closer, so she could not pretend she misunderstood. "Chelsea is facing wire fraud conspiracy, money laundering, and obstruction charges. The case does not depend on a report I can withdraw. Investigators possess foundation logs, bank confirmations, provider-certified communications, and the record of Carter's attempted device wipe. There is no technical error for me to invent and no file I can delete to make those records disappear. Your golden child will be processed like every other defendant appear before a federal judge and answer for money taken from sick children. The designer gown, the country club, and the Kensington name cannot protect her now." Richard had been standing completely silent throughout this exchange, his broad chest heaving with heavy, labored breaths. He was watching his entire universe disintegrate right in front of his eyes. His lucrative business contacts would instantly abandon him the moment the news broke. His social standing in the city was already permanently destroyed by the spectacular implosion at the cathedral. He had zero liquid assets remaining to fight a protracted legal battle against the federal government. The daughter he idolized was ruined, and the daughter he despised was the untouchable architect of his destruction. The crushing weight of his absolute failure finally shattered the last remaining fragments of his psychological restraint. His face turned a dangerous, mottled shade of crimson, and the thick veins in his neck bulged against his collar. The realization that he was completely powerless against me consumed him with a blinding, humiliated rage. He let out a harsh, guttural roar that sounded like a wounded animal. His hands curled into tight, white-knuckled fists at his sides. He abandoned all logic, all reason, and all sense of self-preservation. He locked his furious, bloodshot eyes onto my face and lunged forward. His heavy leather shoes scraped violently against the polished marble as he charged directly at me, his massive fists raised high in the air, ready to strike me down, just as he had always tried to do with his cruel words. He intended to physically punish me for daring to challenge his absolute authority and dismantling his perfect life. Before Richard could even cross the short distance between us or lay a single finger on me, the building security team reacted with terrifying speed and brutal tactical precision. The two broad-shouldered guards who had been standing on high alert immediately intercepted his charge. The guard on the left slammed his shoulder directly into Richard's chest, halting his forward momentum with a sickening crunch of impact. The guard on the right simultaneously grabbed my father's raised arm, twisting it sharply behind his back. Together, they drove him downward with overwhelming physical force. Richard crashed face first into the hard marble floor with a resounding, bone-jarring thud that echoed through the entire lobby. The air was forcefully expelled from his lungs in a sharp, violent gasp. The guards instantly dropped their heavy body weight onto his struggling form, pressing their knees firmly into his back. Richard thrashed wildly against the smooth stone, kicking his legs and screaming muffled, furious obscenities. Patricia shrieked in absolute horror, scrambling backward, away from the violent scuffle. Daniel, the concierge, stood calmly behind his elevated reception desk, holding the telephone to his ear. He met my gaze and offered a short, professional nod, confirming that law enforcement was already en route. The shrill, piercing wail of police sirens began to echo faintly in the distance, bleeding through the thick, reinforced glass doors, growing louder and more insistent by the second. They were coming to arrest my father for assault, adding yet another layer of catastrophic humiliation to their ruined lives. I looked down at Richard, pinned helplessly to the ground, and Patricia weeping hysterically in the corner. I felt a profound sense of closure. I turned my back on them and stepped smoothly into my private elevator. The polished steel doors slid silently shut, leaving them trapped in the wreckage of their own making. The Wilson family's collapse over the next 6 months was swift, public, and entirely documented. Richard was arrested in my building lobby for attempted battery and criminal trespass. Security footage showed him charging at me with both fists raised, so his attorney negotiated a plea rather than risk a trial. He received probation, mandatory anger management counseling, and a permanent protective order forbidding him from entering my home office or workplace. The order was the first legal boundary my father had ever been forced to respect. Chelsea's case moved with even greater speed. The provider records, bank confirmations, and foundation logs left little room for a defense, but the final blow came from Carter. Once he learned that investigators had recovered the attempted remote wipe and frozen the accounts, he accepted a cooperation agreement. He admitted using his position as deputy treasurer to duplicate grant payments and testified that Chelsea selected the offshore entities, monitored the balances, and pressured him to accelerate the theft before the wedding. At trial, Chelsea's attorneys portrayed her as a naive bride manipulated by Preston's disloyal friend. Her own messages destroyed that argument. They showed her calculating transfer limits, mocking the foundation's beneficiaries, and planning to leave the country once the marriage gave her access to Preston's personal wealth. The federal judge emphasized that the stolen money had been reserved for pediatric treatment and community programs. Chelsea was convicted of wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy, and sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. Carter received a reduced sentence because of his cooperation, but his career and friendship with Preston were finished. My parents faced consequences of their own. Financial discovery revealed that Richard and Patricia had financed Chelsea's wedding by taking a second mortgage against the family home, exhausting their credit lines, and signing personal guarantees with several vendors. Donovan's civil action sought recovery of stolen funds and the costs created by the fraudulent event. Although my parents had not designed the embezzlement scheme, their financial commitments to Chelsea left them exposed to enormous legal fees and unpaid obligations. Richard's consulting clients disappeared after the arrest and the national coverage of Chelsea's conviction. Without his income, the mortgage fell into default. He and Patricia filed for personal bankruptcy, surrendered the country club membership they had treated like a family title, and lost the suburban house at foreclosure auction. They moved into a small rental apartment outside the city, surrounded not by the elite circle they had chased, but by unopened legal notices and bills they could no longer shift onto anyone else. I did not attend the trial, the foreclosure sale, or Richard's sentencing hearing. My attorneys monitored the protective order, and my company cooperated only when prosecutors requested authenticated records. For the first time in my life, their emergency did not automatically become my responsibility. The house where I had grown up was eventually sold to a family with 2 young children. I saw the listing photographs once. The rooms looked smaller without my parents' ambitions filling them. I closed the page and returned to work, relieved that the building would finally hold memories unrelated to our family's cruelty. Several weeks after the sentencing, my executive assistant placed a small stack of personal mail on my desk. Beneath the corporate envelopes was a cheap prison envelope stamped with the name of a federal correctional institution 3 states away. I recognized Chelsea's dramatic handwriting before I saw the return address. I opened it only because I wanted to know whether confinement had produced even a trace of accountability. It had not. Chelsea filled 3 pages with complaints about the rough uniform, bland food, rigid schedule, and lack of privacy. She did not mention the children whose treatment money she had stolen. She did not apologize to Preston, acknowledge Carter's testimony, or admit that she had lied to our parents. Instead, she described herself as the victim of a vindictive, wealthy family and a jealous sister who had used computer tricks to destroy her future. The final paragraph contained the real purpose of the letter. She wanted money deposited into her commissary account for better shampoo, writing supplies, snacks, and phone credits. She ended with the sentence, "Sisters have to stand together when the rest of the world turns against us." I read that line twice. Chelsea still believed family was a resource she could activate whenever consequences became uncomfortable. Sisterhood had meant nothing when she stole my savings, mocked my work, banned me from her wedding, and demanded $15,000 for flowers. Now that she needed money, the word suddenly became sacred. I took a black marker and wrote, "Return to sender," across the unopened reply envelope supplied by the prison. I placed Chelsea's letter back inside, sealed it, and dropped it into the outgoing mail tray. I added no explanation. Any explanation would have invited another argument, another performance, and another attempt to make me responsible for the life she had chosen. The boundary felt different from revenge. Revenge would have required me to remain emotionally tied to her discomfort, checking whether prison had humbled her, and measuring satisfaction against each new complaint. Returning the letter required nothing except refusal. I did not need to punish Chelsea. The courts had already done that. I only needed to stop volunteering as her escape route. After the mail was collected, I opened the acquisition proposal, waiting on my monitor. My firm was negotiating the purchase of a respected forensic laboratory in Washington, a move that would expand our evidence validation division and allow us to take larger national cases. For years, family emergencies had interrupted every milestone in my life. This time, no one entered my office demanding money, obedience, or silence. I reviewed the proposal uninterrupted. Chelsea's letter did not reopen the wound. It proved that the wound had closed. During those same months, the Wilson name continued shrinking beneath bankruptcy notices and court records, while my professional world expanded through work that could withstand scrutiny. I did not need their downfall to measure my progress. The contrast was simply impossible to ignore. For the first time, my future was being shaped by my decisions rather than by their expectations. The spectacular public implosion of Chelsea's wedding and her subsequent federal conviction became a massive corporate scandal. Donovan Kensington was not a man who kept quiet about his victories. He openly credited my cybersecurity firm for flawlessly dismantling the embezzlement scheme and protecting his family from a financial disaster. That high-profile endorsement acted as an absolute catalyst for my business. My agency was suddenly thrust into the national spotlight. We were flooded with inquiries from elite clients who demanded the best protection available. Fortune 500 chief executive officers and private billionaires rushed to secure our exclusive services. We rapidly expanded our operations, moving into a massive, state-of-the-art headquarters in the financial district. My personal reputation as a brilliant investigator skyrocketed. In late October, a premier national business magazine requested an exclusive interview. A week later, my face was featured prominently on their glossy cover under a bold headline praising my innovative approach to corporate cybersecurity. I had built an empire entirely on my own terms. The attention could easily have turned the case into another family spectacle, so I set strict boundaries around every interview. I discussed the forensic process, the importance of lawful evidence collection, and the controls charities needed to prevent insider fraud. I never released Chelsea's private photographs, repeated her personal insults, or used my parents' downfall as a marketing story. The facts that belonged in court stayed in court. That restraint earned more respect than revenge ever could. Senior investigators began referring complex matters to us because they knew our reports would survive aggressive legal challenges. I promoted Marcus to lead the new Incident Response Division and gave the analysts who had preserved the Kensington evidence formal credit for their work. The firm's success was not built on one dramatic revelation. It was built on a team that had refused shortcuts when shortcuts would have been emotionally satisfying. When the Washington acquisition closed, our staff gathered in the new conference room beneath a wall displaying the principles that governed every case authorization, preservation, verification, and truth. I stood beneath those words and understood why my life felt different. My family had always treated power as the ability to control a narrative. I had built power by creating records that no narrative could erase. It was a crisp Friday evening in early December when I finally took a moment to celebrate the extraordinary success of the past year. I decided to host an elegant dinner party at my penthouse to honor the people who had genuinely supported my journey. My spacious chef's kitchen was filled with the rich, savory aromas of roasted garlic and fresh herbs as a private culinary team prepared a luxurious 5-course meal. I walked through the open living area, adjusting the delicate arrangements of white orchids resting on the sleek glass tables. The warm, golden glow of modern string lighting reflected beautifully against the floor-to-ceiling windows. I paused for a moment near the entryway to admire the framed magazine cover hanging proudly on the wall. I was wearing a stunning emerald green silk dress that made me feel incredibly powerful and completely authentic. I did not have to hide my intelligence or downplay my success to make anyone else feel comfortable. I heard the gentle chime of the private elevator signaling the arrival of my first guests. I smoothed my dress and walked forward to greet them with a genuine welcoming smile. The penthouse quickly filled with the joyful sounds of laughter and engaging conversation. The space was alive with the vibrant energy of brilliant, accomplished people who truly valued my presence. I was surrounded by my loyal senior analysts, my trusted industry mentors, and genuine friends who respected my intellect and my relentless drive. There was no underlying tension or passive-aggressive commentary hidden beneath forced smiles. No one was subtly comparing my achievements to a golden sibling. We sat around the massive oak dining table sharing incredible food and exchanging stories of our professional triumphs. My lead technical director offered a touching toast, praising my visionary leadership and the healthy, supportive culture I had carefully cultivated within our rapidly growing firm. I felt a deep, overwhelming sense of belonging that I had never once experienced during 30 years of miserable Sunday dinners at my parents' suburban mansion. I was finally sitting at a table where I did not have to fight for a seat. After the magnificent dessert was served, the guests slowly transitioned into the comfortable seating area of the adjacent media room. I poured myself a fresh glass of an exceptional vintage red wine and leaned against the granite kitchen counter, just soaking in the beautiful atmosphere of the evening. The television in the media room was playing quietly behind the conversation. A local anchor briefly mentioned that the former Wilson residence had been sold following the owner's bankruptcy, and that Chelsea's appeal had been denied. The report used an old photograph from the wedding, freezing her forever in the moment before the documents reached the altar. I watched for only a few seconds. Then I picked up the remote and lowered the volume until the broadcast disappeared beneath the laughter around me. The people gathered in my home did not need the details explained. They knew me through the company we had built together, the difficult cases we had survived, and the respect we had earned from one another. No one at that table cared whether Patricia had once considered me socially acceptable. My technical director raised his glass and thanked me for creating a firm where evidence mattered more than ego. The room answered with warm applause. I lifted my Cabernet and looked across the faces of friends, mentors, and colleagues who had never required me to become smaller for their comfort. Chelsea had spent her life trying to enter an elite family by manufacturing an image. I had built a genuine family by choosing people capable of honesty. The news moved on to another story, so did I. The story of my own family is a stark reminder that the people who share your blood will not always protect your heart or genuinely respect your worth. For decades, I allowed my parents to dictate my value. I believed their narrative that I was somehow less than my sister simply because I chose a different path and refused to conform to their superficial standards. I learned the hard way that you cannot heal in the same environment that broke you. True independence is not just financial. It is profoundly emotional. It is the absolute refusal to let anyone else write your story. When you are cast as the scapegoat in a toxic family dynamic, the most powerful thing you can do is walk away and build a life so authentic and undeniably fulfilling that their opinions simply cease to matter. You do not owe your loyalty to people who only value you when you are silent and compliant. Forgiveness is a personal choice, but access to your life is a privilege that must be earned. Surviving that rejection was the crucible that forged my ultimate success. The ashes of their manufactured reality provided the perfect foundation for my own genuine empire. If you have ever felt invisible or diminished by the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally, please know that their failure to see your brilliance does not extinguish your light. You have the power to define your own success and curate your own carefully chosen family. Have you ever had to draw a hard line with toxic relatives to protect your inner peace? Share your experiences in the comments below. Do not forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories of reclaiming your power and building the life you truly deserve.